Howdy, stranger. Tonight we're pushing through those creaky saloon doors and stepping back into the dust-caked reality of Old West drinking establishments. And let me tell you right now, this isn't the Hollywood version you've been fed. If you were suddenly transported to a real 1870s saloon with your fancy filtered water expectations and hand sanitizer habits, you probably wouldn't survive until morning. The bacteria alone would make your immune system wave a white flag faster than you can say dysentery. Before we saddle up, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious who's awake when Desligue as notificações, vai desacelerando os pensamentos. E imagina que a única luz ao redor vem de uma fogueira. É ali que a história de hoje começa. Enquanto você escuta de olhos fechados e deixa que o Velho Oeste te faça companhia até o sono chegar, you push through the batwing doors of the Frontier Saloon, and immediately your senses are assaulted. Not by the smell of whiskey, though that's certainly present, but by a complex tapestry of odors you weren't expecting. Tobacco smoke hanging thick as morning fog, unwashed bodies, leather, coffee, perfume attempting to mask body odor, and something else, ... something vaguely food adjacent that you can't quite identify. This isn't the gleaming mahogany and crystal playground from Deadwood or Westworld. The real Frontier Saloon of the 1860s through 1890s was usually a hastily constructed affair, sometimes literally a tent with a plank of wood laid across two barrels. The elaborate establishments with chandeliers and polished bars, those came later, once towns had established themselves and actually had, things like regular shipments of supplies and building materials. What surprises you most is how small many saloons are, often just a single room with a crude bar along one wall. The floor beneath your feet might be bare earth in the most primitive establishments, though wooden planks would become standard as a town developed. And those wooden floors, they're disgusting, absolutely revolting. A mixture of spilled drinks, tobacco juice from the spittoons that many patrons miss entirely, mud, and occasionally blood has created a substance that your boots stick to with each step. You notice something else missing, those big, ornate mirrors behind the bar. While they did exist in more upscale establishments, many frontier saloons couldn't afford such luxuries. Mirrors were expensive and difficult to transport across rough terrain without breaking. When they did appear, they served a practical purpose beyond vanity, allowing patrons to see if someone was sneaking up behind them. In a world where arguments could escalate to gunfire with alarming speed, this wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The lighting is terrible by modern standards. A few oil lamps cast wavering shadows, and maybe some candles stuck in bottles provide additional illumination. During daylight hours, windows might help, but they're often covered with cheap cloth rather than glass, another luxury item that was difficult to transport intact. "What'll it be?" asks the bartender, a man whose face tells the story of hard living. His hands are calloused, missing half a finger on the left, and his forearms are corded with muscle from hauling barrels and breaking up fights. And here's where we hit our first major misconception. You open your mouth to say whiskey, thinking that's what everyone drank, but you pause. Looking around, you notice people drinking a surprising variety of beverages. Yes, whiskey is common, but it's not the only option, and what they're calling whiskey might shock your modern palate. Historians still debate exactly what percentage of frontier saloon patrons actually drank straight whiskey as their primary beverage. Some contemporary accounts suggest it was as low as 50%, with the rest choosing beer, wine, mixed drinks, yes, they had those, or even non-alcoholic options like coffee, tea, or Saloons. What's truly fascinating is that the iconic image of the cowboy tossing back shots of whiskey was partly created by Hollywood and partly by the temperance movement, which wanted to portray saloons as dens of hard liquor consumption, rather than social gathering places where people might have a beer and chat about the weather. You look more closely at the shelves behind the bar and notice an array of bottles with labels you don't recognize. Some contain liquids that are clearly not whiskey, ranging from amber to clear to even bright green. These frontier saloons were selling everything from imported brandies to local moonshine, from rum to gin, and even early versions of cocktails with elaborate names. And those saloon girls you expected to see swanning around in feather boas and revealing corsets. The reality is much more complex. While some establishments did feature women who provided companionship, and sometimes more, many frontier saloons were strictly male domains. In others, the girls were primarily there to encourage drinking. They earned a commission on the drinks they could convince patrons to buy. Their clothing was usually more modest than Hollywood would have you believe. Provocation had its limits in Victorian America, even on the frontier. As you continue to hesitate over your order, the bartender's eyebrow raises questioningly. Around you, the saloon is coming to life as evening approaches. A piano player in the corner thumps out a tune that sounds vaguely familiar, but definitely not as polished as the Western soundtrack you're used to. The game of chance in the corner isn't elegant poker, but rather faro, the dominant gambling game of the frontier that's now nearly forgotten. The bartender clears his throat, waiting for your decision. What you order next will determine your first authentic taste of the real Wild West saloon experience, and it might not be what you expected at all. You decide to play it safe and ask for whiskey, and the bartender reaches beneath the counter. What he places before you isn't the amber liquid in a crystal tumbler you were expecting. Instead, it's a cloudy, pale yellowish fluid in a smudged glass that you're pretty sure hasn't been properly washed since the last patron used it. Welcome to the truth about frontier spirits. That'll be 2 bits, he says, which translates to about 25 cents in the currency of the day. That might sound cheap, but in the 1870s, that's equivalent to about $5 to $7 in today's money for what amounts to a shot, not exactly the bargain you might have expected. Quality imported whiskey could cost significantly more. You eye the suspicious liquid warily. The first thing you need to understand about frontier whiskey is that it bore little resemblance to the carefully aged, regulated spirits you know today. Much of what was served in these establishments was what they called trade whiskey, a product manufactured quickly and cheaply with profit as the only consideration. Taking a cautious sniff, your eyes water immediately. The aroma is sharp, chemical, and has notes that remind you more of paint thinner than anything you'd willingly put in your body. This is what historians often refer to as frontier rotgut, and for good reason. Most frontier whiskey wasn't aged at all. The clear liquid straight from the still was often colored with tobacco juice, molasses, burnt sugar, or even creosote to give it that amber hue people associated with quality. If you're wondering, yes, creosote is the same stuff used to preserve railroad ties and telegraph poles. Delicious, right? Something wrong with your drink, stranger? The bartender asks, noticing your hesitation. Around you, locals are knocking back similar glasses without batting an eye. Their tolerance isn't just psychological, it's physical. Regular consumers of this stuff built up a resistance to impurities that would floor a modern drinker. The alcohol content is another surprise. While modern American whiskey is typically 40 to 50% alcohol by volume, frontier whiskey could range anywhere from 70% to a throat-searing 190 proof, 95% alcohol, nearly pure ethanol. No wonder they called it firewater. You take a tiny sip and immediately regret it. The liquid burns like liquid fire, and you fight the urge to spit it across the room. This isn't the smooth, caramel-noted bourbon you might sip while streaming your favorite western. This is chemical warfare in a glass. First time with the local shine? A grizzled miner asks, chuckling at your obvious discomfort. You'll get used to it, or you'll go blind. Either way, the scenery around here ain't much to look at anyhow. He laughs at his own joke, revealing a mouth with more gaps than teeth. What's truly fascinating is that, in this era before federal regulation, what constituted whiskey varied wildly from place to place and bartender to bartender. The Pure Food and Drug Act wouldn't come along until 1906, and until then, frontier spirits were a lawless landscape of creative chemistry. Some historians have analyzed preserved bottles of frontier spirits and found them to contain everything from iodine to gunpowder, from tobacco juice to red pepper, from glycerin to formaldehyde. One analysis of a bottle from a Wyoming saloon circa 1883 revealed traces of strychnine, yes, the rat poison, added presumably to give the drink an extra kick. Looking around the saloon again, you notice something interesting. Despite the Hollywood image of everyone drinking whiskey straight, many patrons are consuming what appear to be mixed drinks. The bartender is adding various ingredients to glasses, suggesting that even in the 1870s, people were trying to make this rotgut somewhat palatable, trying to sweeten that up for you. You ask the bartender as he adds something to another patron's glass. This here's a stone fence, he explains, mixing hard cider with whiskey. Popular with the ladies and tenderfeet. Other common concoctions included the whistling Rufus whiskey with a splash of hot water, sugar, and lemon peel. The Blue Blazer literally lighting whiskey on fire and passing it between two metal cups, and various punches made with whatever fruit might be available. Beer offers another surprise. It's not the crisp, clear beverage you're accustomed to, but rather a room temperature, cloudy liquid with questionable carbonation. Refrigeration is a luxury most frontier saloons don't have, so the beer is stored in barrels and served at whatever the ambient temperature happens to be, often quite warm in the summer months. And the beer selection? Forget your IPAs and craft brews. Most frontier saloons offered one, maybe two types of beer, usually locally brewed and of wildly inconsistent quality. The dominant style was American lager, brought over by German immigrants and adapted to local conditions and ingredients. What truly shocks you is seeing several patrons drinking something that isn't alcohol at all. Coffee, thick, black, and strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, is surprisingly popular, especially among those who need to keep their wits about them for evening gambling or early morning work. We get our whiskey shipments from back east every couple months, the bartender explains, seeing your continued interest in the bottles behind him. But between times, Crazy Joe up in the hills keeps us supplied with his homemade lightning. Only killed 3 men last year, which is an improvement. You can't tell if he's joking. The quality divide in frontier spirits was enormous. While wealthy patrons in established cities might enjoy imported cognac or genuine Kentucky bourbon, the average cowhand or miner was drinking what amounted to industrial alcohol mixed with flavorings and colorings, a concoction that would likely violate dozens of modern health regulations. We did get a bottle of the real stuff in last week, the bartender mentions, reaching for a bottle kept separate from the others. Kentucky straight bourbon, aged a whole year. He says this with genuine pride, as though a year is an impressively long time. By modern standards, where premium whiskies are often aged 8 to 20 years, this is practically newborn spirit. But on the frontier, where immediate consumption was the norm, anything aged at all was considered a luxury. The price he names for a shot of this premium whiskey makes your eyes widen. It's nearly a day's wages for an average worker. Clearly, Quality was recognized and valued, even if it was rarely available to most saloon patrons. As you contemplate whether to risk another sip of your questionable whiskey, you find yourself paying more attention to the man behind the bar. The frontier bartender was far more than just someone who poured drinks. He was part chemist, part therapist, part security guard, and often the most informed person in town. Been tending bar long? You ask, hoping to distract him from the fact that you've barely touched your drink. Going on 15 years now, he replies, polishing a glass with a rag that appears to be making it dirtier rather than cleaner. Started in St. Louis, worked my way west with the railroads, been in this town 3 years, which is about 2 years and 11 months longer than most places last out here. The bartender of the Old West was often a surprisingly respectable figure in frontier society. Unlike the rough-and-tumble patrons he served, he typically wore a clean white shirt, sometimes with sleeve garters to keep the cuffs from dragging through the drinks. A vest was standard attire, providing both respectability and convenient pockets for various tools of the trade. You notice he's wearing a gun, not on his hip like the cowboys in the corner, but tucked into a holster under his arm. Bartenders were often the first and last line of defense in maintaining order, and while the famous shotgun behind the bar did exist in some establishments, most preferred a more concealable weapon. Had to use that much? You ask, nodding toward the subtle bulge of his shoulder holster. He smiles thinly. A good bartender rarely needs to draw. Words settle more problems than bullets, and knowing when to stop serving a man is better protection than any Colt. Historians still debate how violent the average frontier saloon actually was. Contemporary newspapers certainly reported shootings and brawls, but evidence suggests that deadly violence was far less common than Hollywood portrays. Many establishments had strict rules about checking weapons at the door, particularly in more established towns. What's fascinating is what this man knows about mixing drinks. While not the elaborate cocktail artisans of later decades, frontier bartenders had their own repertoire of techniques and recipes. You watch as he prepares something for another customer, cracking an egg into a glass and separating the white with casual expertise before adding whiskey, sugar, and what appears to be bitters. Whiskey flip, he explains, noticing your interest. Good for what ails you. The arsenal of ingredients behind a frontier bar would surprise modern drinkers. Besides the expected whiskeys and beers, most bartenders kept bitters, both medicinal and flavoring varieties, eggs, lemons or limes when available, various sugars and syrups, and sometimes unexpected additions like cayenne pepper, gunpowder, yes, actual gunpowder for certain medicinal drinks, and assorted herbs. Most fellas know one way to mix a drink, the bartender continues, warming to his subject. I know 53 different preparations, learned from an old riverboat gambler who claimed he'd tended bar for Andrew Jackson himself. This isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Bartending knowledge was passed down through an informal apprenticeship system, with techniques and recipes sometimes tracing back decades. The first American Bartender's Guide, How to Mix Drinks, or the Bon Vivant's Companion, was published in 1862 by Jerry Thomas, documenting hundreds of recipes that had previously existed only in oral tradition. What's your most popular drink? You ask, still stalling on consuming your own. Besides straight whiskey, the stone fence I mentioned. Army grog does well when the cavalry boys are in town. That's rum with water, lime if we have it, and brown sugar. The miners prefer miner's punch, whiskey with a raw egg beaten in and a spoonful of molasses. Puts hair on your chest and keeps you going for a 12-hour shift. The mention of eggs in drinks might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but they were a common ingredient in frontier cocktails. Egg whites provided texture and froth, while whole eggs added richness and were believed to have nutritional benefits, important in an era when many saloon patrons weren't eating regular meals. As you watch him work, you notice something else. The bartender doesn't use precise measurements. There are no jiggers or measuring cups in sight. Drinks are poured by eye, with quantities described in vague terms like 2 fingers, the width of fingers held against the glass, or a splash. "You're not from around here," he observes, stating the obvious. "Let me fix you something more suited to an Easterner's constitution." Without waiting for your response, he takes your barely touched whiskey and pours it into a new concoction. He adds what looks like honey, a dash of bitters, and hot water from a kettle kept warming on a small stove behind the bar. "Hot toddy," he explains, sliding the steaming glass back to you. "Won't burn your gullet out like drinking it straight." You take a cautious sip and find it surprisingly palatable, the heat, sweetness, and spice of the bitters masking the harsh qualities of the whiskey. It's not exactly delicious by modern standards, but it's a significant improvement. The bartender's techniques reveal another aspect of frontier drinking culture, the personalization of service. Unlike the standardized drinks we expect today, frontier bartenders often tailored their offerings to the individual customer, considering factors like their apparent tolerance, social standing, and even their line of work. The cattle drivers who come through want something strong enough to make them forget the trail dust, he explains. The card players want something that won't dull their wits. Ladies, when they do come in, prefer wine when we have it, or something sweet to cover the taste of the alcohol. This mention of wine piques your interest. While not as common as whiskey or beer, wine was certainly present in frontier saloons, particularly in areas with significant European immigrant populations. California wine production was already established by the 1870s, though quality varied dramatically. More commonly, frontier saloons might offer fortified wines like port or sherry, which traveled better and had longer shelf lives. "Got a barrel of California Red in last month," the bartender says, following your gaze to a small cask in the corner. "Sells for a premium, mostly to the mining engineers and the schoolmarm. Not that she ever comes in here herself. Sends her brother to fetch it in a teapot." He winks at this small subterfuge that maintains the woman's respectability. The issue of adulteration wasn't limited to whiskey. Beer was often watered down, particularly toward the bottom of the barrel. Wine might be extended with water and sugar, or fortified with extra alcohol. The frontier bartender's role as amateur chemist extended to making the most of limited supplies. "You see that fellow in the corner?" The bartender nods discreetly toward a well-dressed man playing cards. He brings his own bottle, French cognac. Keeps it with Liam here behind the bar when he's not drinking it. Smart man, had a bottle of the good stuff swapped for colored water once in Dodge City. This practice of bottle keep, where regular patrons with means would purchase a full bottle and have the bartender store it for their exclusive use, was common in more established saloons. It guaranteed quality and prevented tampering, a genuine concern in an era of creative beverage adulteration. As you sip your toddy, you begin to appreciate the frontier bartender as more than just a server of drinks. He was an information broker, a community leader, often the most literate person in a small settlement, and sometimes the closest thing to a doctor for many miles. "Sheriff will be by later," he mentions casually while wiping down the bar. Always stops in around 8 to hear what's what. Saves him a lot of trouble to know who's in town and who's drinking heavy. This casual comment reveals another critical role of the frontier bartender: unofficial deputy and early warning system for law enforcement. Many frontier sheriffs had informal arrangements with local bartenders who would alert them to troublemakers, wanted men, or brewing conflicts before they erupted into violence. As you sip your hot toddy and chat with the bartender, a commotion erupts at the far end of the bar. A wiry man with a pockmarked face pounds his fist on the counter, his voice rising above the general hum of conversation. "This ain't whiskey," he shouts, slamming down his glass. "This is poison. Tastes like you filtered it through a dead man's boot." The bartender sighs, jabs at it again. Same complaint every payday, still keeps coming back. He moves down the bar with practiced efficiency, lowering his voice to calm the agitated customer. You've just encountered one of the most infamous aspects of frontier drinking culture, the world of rotgut and adulterated spirits. While all frontier whiskey was rough by modern standards, there existed a special category of products that were genuinely dangerous, often called tanglefoot, tarantula juice, skull varnish, or most commonly, rotgut. The angry customer isn't wrong. What he's been served might indeed be poisonous by any reasonable definition. Frontier whiskey adulteration went far beyond simple dilution. Unscrupulous producers and bartenders employed a shocking array of additives to stretch their product, enhance its effects, or mimic the properties of better spirits. What's actually in that stuff? You ask when the bartender returns. Having placated Jeb with what appears to be a free drink, he shrugs. Depends who made it. The stuff from back east, that's mostly proper distilled grain with some flavorings. The local shine. He pauses, seeming to consider how much to reveal. Let's just say it started as alcohol. What else went in is between the maker and his maker, if you take my meaning. Historians have documented the common additives in frontier rotgut, and the list reads like a hazardous materials inventory. Raw alcohol, diluted with turpentine, ammonia used to create artificial aging, burnt sugar for color, cayenne pepper for bite, tobacco juice for color and extra kick, and in some truly frightening cases, strychnine or sulfuric acid in minute quantities to give an extra burn and heightened intoxication effect. A particularly nasty concoction, known as 40-rod whiskey, got its name from the folk claim that it would kill a man at 40 rods, 220 yards, either by drinking it or being shot with it. One frontier doctor described it as 1 part damnable, 2 parts impossible, with a dash of low-down skunkery. What's truly staggering is that this wasn't some black market product. This was standard fare in many remote or low-end establishments. Before federal regulation, there was no legal definition of whiskey, and no authority consistently inspecting or enforcing quality standards. Ever had anyone go blind from your drinks? You ask, only half joking. The bartender's expression darkens slightly. Not from mine. But there was a place in Dry Gulch where 3 miners lost their sight after a bad batch. Owner skipped town before they could string him up. This wasn't hyperbole. Methanol would alcohol poisoning, a common result of poorly managed distillation or deliberate adulteration, could indeed cause blindness or death. An 1873 medical journal documented over 24 cases of blindness attributed to adulterated whiskey in a single Colorado mining town over just 6 months. Historians still debate exactly how common such extreme cases were. Contemporary temperance literature certainly emphasized these dangers, sometimes exaggerating for effect, but medical records and newspaper accounts provide ample evidence that dangerous adulteration was a genuine public health issue on the frontier. Most barkeeps have a code, your bartender explains, seemingly eager to distinguish himself from the truly unscrupulous. You water it down, sure. Add some coloring, some flavoring. Customers expect that. But you don't add nothing that'll put a man in the ground. Bad for repeat business, if nothing else. This pragmatic approach to business ethics was common. In isolated communities where reputation was everything, bartenders who consistently served dangerous products wouldn't last long, either through loss of customers or more direct frontier justice. The fascinating thing is how frontier drinkers adapted to this reality. Most developed elaborate rituals to test unfamiliar spirits before consuming them. A common test was to pour a small amount of whiskey onto a hot stove. Pure whiskey would burn with a blue flame, while many adulterants would produce yellow flames, strong odors, or other telltale signs. Another popular test was the gunpowder test, mixing whiskey with gunpowder and attempting to ignite it. If the mixture burned, the whiskey was considered reasonably pure. If it failed to ignite, it contained too much water or other non-flammable adulterants. You notice a man at the end of the bar performing a different test. He drops a piece of hard bread into his drink, waits a moment, then fishes it out and inspects it before tasting his whiskey. This was checking for copper sulfate, a common additive used to enhance the burning sensation of diluted spirits. The bread would turn blue-green if this chemical was present. Smart fella, the bartender nods approvingly, though most of the boys just throw it back and hope for the best. Beyond the realm of whiskey, the Frontier Saloon offered another category of questionable consumables: patent medicines and bitters, often sold right alongside traditional spirits. The line between medicinal and recreational consumption was blurry at best. Lady came in yesterday selling this, the bartender says, pulling out a fancy bottle with an elaborate label promising Dr. Kilmer's swamp root, a blessing to mankind. According to the small print, it cured everything from kidney disease to female complaints to melancholy. Bought a few bottles, good for customers who need a pick-me-up, but want to pretend they're taking medicine, not drinking. Mostly alcohol anyway, with some herbs for taste. These patent medicines were indeed primarily alcohol, often 40% or higher, mixed with various herbs, spices, and sometimes genuinely dangerous additives like cocaine, morphine, or chloral hydrate. They were consumed enthusiastically by people who might otherwise avoid drinking, including women and temperance advocates who convinced themselves they were taking medicine rather than consuming alcohol. But there's a different category altogether, the bartender says, pointing to a row of smaller bottles labeled as bitters. Medicinal, supposedly, but the cowboys order M by the glass, not by the drop like the doctor recommends. Bitters occupied a fascinating middle ground in frontier drinking culture. Originally developed as medicinal preparations, they contained various herbs, roots, and barks infused in alcohol. While some were legitimately used as digestive aids or for treating specific ailments, many were simply another form of alcoholic beverage hiding behind medical pretenses. The most famous, Angostura bitters, was indeed used in small quantities as a cocktail ingredient, but many others were consumed by the glassful. Hostater's stomach bitters, for instance, was 47% alcohol, stronger than whiskey, yet marketed as a health tonic. What's truly remarkable is how these various categories of potent potables coexisted in the Frontier Saloon. A typical establishment might serve everything from raw frontier whiskey to imported cognac, from locally brewed beer to patent medicines, all without clear distinction between beverage and medicine. This blurring extended to the language used. A man might order a reviver when feeling low, a bracer when needing energy, or a pick-me-up after a long day's work, all euphemisms that maintained the pretense that alcohol served medicinal purposes rather than simply providing intoxication. Most interesting drink request I ever got, the bartender muses, in response to your question. Bello came in after riding 3 days straight, asked for something to kill the dust and revive the dead. I mixed him whiskey with Hostater's bitters, dropped in a raw egg, and stirred in a spoonful of blackstrap molasses. Called it a resurrection. He drank 3, slept for 16 hours straight under that table, then woke up and ordered breakfast like nothing happened. These frontier cocktails, while creative, often served a practical purpose beyond simple intoxication. In an era before reliable, safe water, consistent food supplies, or readily available healthcare, alcohol-based concoctions were self-medication for everything from physical ailments to psychological distress, and despite the dangers of adulterated spirits, there was a certain democratic quality to frontier drinking culture. Whether you were a wealthy cattle baron or a dusty cowhand, you faced the same basic question with each glass. Was this drink going to provide the expected relief, or was it going to cause problems far worse than those you were trying to escape? Your stomach growls loudly enough for the bartender to hear over the saloon's ambient noise. He gives you a knowing look and gestures toward a side door. Hungry, stranger, kitchen's through there. Mrs. Holloway runs it separate from the bar. Food's extra, but it'll stick to your ribs better than just whiskey. You realize you haven't eaten since morning and decide to investigate this frontier dining experience. Pushing through the indicated door, you enter a small, steamy room adjacent to the main saloon space. The pungent aroma of cooking food hits you, a mix of frying grease, boiled meat, and something vaguely spicy that you can't identify. A stern-looking woman in her 50s, hair tightly bound beneath a kerchief and arms bare to the elbows, looks up from a massive Castian stove. This is clearly Mrs. Holloway, the saloon's cook and food proprietor. Sit anywhere, she instructs, gesturing to two small tables pressed against the wall. Menus the same as yesterday and the day before. You're surprised to discover that there's food available at all. The Hollywood version of Saloons rarely depicts much beyond the occasional bowl of peanuts or hard-boiled eggs. The reality of frontier saloon food was far more substantial and more vital to the business model than most realize. What's good today? You ask, taking a seat at one of the small tables. Mrs. Holloway gives you a look that suggests this is a foolish question. Stew's hot, beans ain't burned, and the biscuits just came out. That's what's good. This no-nonsense approach was typical of frontier food service. Unlike modern restaurants with extensive menus, saloon kitchens typically offered a limited rotation of hearty, calorie-dense foods designed to complement drinking and keep patrons in the establishment longer. Historians have documented that food service was far more common in frontier saloons than popular culture suggests. In many mining towns and cattle outposts, the saloon might be the only establishment serving prepared food, making it an essential community resource beyond just providing alcohol. What's set before you minutes later is a surprisingly generous portion. A deep bowl of rich brown stew filled with chunks of meat and root vegetables. A side plate with 3 biscuits that steam when broken open. And a smaller dish of beans seasoned with what tastes like molasses and pepper. It's simple food, but the aroma makes your mouth water. That'll be for bits. Mrs. Holloway informs you, twice the price of your whiskey, highlighting the relative value of food versus alcohol on the frontier. The meat in the stew presents your first surprise. This isn't beef, despite being in cattle country. The texture is different, gamier, chewier. This is likely venison, elk, or even buffalo, depending on the region and season. Frontier saloon kitchens relied heavily on local game, which was often more readily available than beef in remote areas. As you eat, a miner at the next table notices your interest in the food. Thursday's the best day, he informs you through a mouthful of biscuit. Freight wagon comes Wednesday, so the meat in the stew ain't walked quite as far as it does by Monday. He laughs at his own joke, revealing a row of blackened teeth. What's fascinating about frontier saloon food is how it adapted to extreme limitations in ingredients, storage, and preparation methods. Without refrigeration, preservation relied on smoking, salting, drying, or, in winter months, simply freezing meat outdoors. Fresh vegetables were seasonal and often scarce, making preserved options like beans and root vegetables dietary staples. The biscuits are excellent, you tell Mrs. Holloway, who acknowledges the compliment with a curt nod. Sourdough starter's been going 8 years, she replies with a hint of pride. Brought it over the mountains myself, when we came west in '65. This casual comment reveals another aspect of frontier food culture, the importance of sourdough. Before commercial yeast was widely available, sourdough cultures were precious possessions, carefully maintained and even passed down through generations. A good starter was literally a living connection to the past and an essential tool for bread making on the frontier. The beans you're eating represent another frontier staple, often called bear sign or whiskey beans. These were typically pinto or navy beans, slow-cooked with molasses, pepper, and sometimes a small amount of salt pork for flavor. High in protein and calories, they provided sustenance that helped patrons drink longer without becoming excessively intoxicated, a benefit for the saloon's bottom line. A commotion from the main room draws your attention. A group of cowboys has just entered, bringing with them the smell of dust, horses, and the open range. They head straight for Mrs. Holloway's domain, clearly familiar with the routine. The usual 4-4, she asks, already reaching for plates. 5 today, corrects the leader. A weathered man with a substantial mustache. Got a new hand, and double portions. We ain't eaten since yesterday noon. These men represent the core customer base for many frontier saloons, working cowboys, miners, freighters, and other laborers whose physically demanding jobs required substantial caloric intake. For these men, the saloon wasn't just a place to drink, it was often their primary source of cooked food when in town. The usual that arrives for the cowboys is similar to your meal but in larger portions, with the addition of thick slices of sourdough bread spread with what appears to be fresh churned butter, likely a luxury in this environment, and a sign that these are valued regular customers. You notice something else interesting. 2 of the cowboys aren't drinking alcohol at all, but rather coffee served in large tin cups. This contradicts another Hollywood myth, that everyone in a saloon was there to get drunk. Many patrons came primarily for the food and companionship, with alcohol being secondary or even irrelevant to their visit. Mrs. Holloway makes the best bear sign west of the Missouri. One of the cowboys tells you, noticing your observation of their meal. Worth riding an extra day just for a plate of them beans. The hyperbole might be thick, but the sentiment reflects the genuine importance of reliable food sources in frontier communities. A saloon with a reputation for decent food could draw patrons from surprising distances in an era when culinary options were severely limited. Some of the most common foods served in frontier saloons included stews and soups. These could stretch limited meat supplies and hide the quality or lack thereof of ingredients. Beans, high in protein and inexpensive to prepare in large quantities. Biscuits and bread, often sourdough based due to the scarcity of commercial yeast. Salt pork or bacon, used both as a main dish and as flavoring for other foods. Game meats, whatever was locally available, from venison to prairie chicken. Eggs, when available, often pickled to extend shelf life. Oysters, surprisingly common, as canned or pickled oysters traveled well and were considered a luxury. Mrs. Holloway returns to your table, refilling your coffee cup without asking, an act of frontier hospitality. Save room, she advises. Got pie today. Pie was indeed a special treat in frontier establishments, often made with dried fruits, reconstituted in liquor or whatever seasonal berries might be available. Apple pie was particularly popular when possible, with dried apples being a staple trade good that traveled well. What kind of pie, you ask, already anticipating dessert despite the substantial meal. Just pie, She responds with the pragmatism of someone who doesn't see the need for further specification. Apples in it, some raisins, bit of whiskey to wake it up. This casual mention of whiskey in the pie filling highlights another aspect of frontier cooking. Alcohol wasn't just for drinking. It was a preservative, a flavoring agent, and sometimes even a safety measure in environments where water quality was questionable. A young man enters from a back door, carrying a wooden crate filled with vegetables, some potatoes, onions, and what appears to be a small cabbage. From the widow Jenkins, he tells Mrs. Holloway, says it's payment for feeding her boys last week when they were broke. This brief interaction reveals the complex economic system that often surrounded frontier saloons. Barter arrangements were common, with food and drinks sometimes exchanged for goods, services, or future considerations rather than cash. In communities where currency could be scarce, these informal economic networks were essential. As you finish your meal and contemplate the promised pie, you realize that the frontier saloon functioned as far more than a drinking establishment. It was often the community kitchen, a social welfare system for those down on their luck, and one of the few places where a traveler could reliably find a hot meal in remote territories. The quality of saloon food varied dramatically, of course. Establishments in more established towns might offer relatively sophisticated fare, while those in remote mining camps might serve little beyond beans and hardtack. But across the spectrum, food was an integral part of the frontier saloon experience, one that history and Hollywood have largely overlooked in favor of focusing exclusively on the drinks and occasional gunfights. After finishing your surprisingly satisfying meal, including a slice of Mrs. Holloway's whiskey-laced apple pie that somehow managed to be both tough and delicious, you return to the main saloon area. The evening crowd has grown, and you notice something you missed earlier. A small table near the bar with a spread of food laid out on platters. "Help yourself," the bartender says, noticing your curious glance. "Free lunch for paying customers." Mrs. Holloway puts it out fresh at noon and again at 6. You've just encountered one of the most famous, yet misunderstood institutions of the frontier saloon, the legendary free lunch. And yes, this is precisely where the saying "there's no such thing as a free lunch" originated. A phrase that would later be adopted by economists to explain that seemingly free offerings always come with hidden costs. The free lunch counter was a genuine phenomenon that peaked in the 1870s-1890s across America, particularly in saloons along the frontier. The concept was simple but brilliant. Offer complimentary food to anyone purchasing drinks. The practice began in New Orleans and San Francisco before spreading across the Western territories. You approach the spread with interest. It's not the elaborate buffet you might have imagined, but rather a strategic selection of foods designed with a specific purpose in mind. The offerings typically include heavily salted meats, including thin sliced ham and what appears to be beef, jerky, pickled eggs, sitting in a large jar of cloudy brine, sardines, and pickled herring, several varieties of cheese, cut into small cubes, crackers and bread, pickles, olives, and various pickled vegetables. The pattern becomes obvious after a moment's thought. Everything is salty, spicy, or otherwise designed to induce thirst. This is no act of frontier generosity. It's a carefully calculated business strategy. "Slickest business move ever invented," comments an older gentleman who's helping himself to a generous portion of salted ham. Saloon up in Helena tried to be the first to stop offering it, went out of business in a month. Customers expect it now. The economics of the free lunch were fascinating. Saloon owners calculated that the average patron would consume enough extra drinks, driven by the salty foods, to more than cover the cost of the modest spread. Additionally, the offer of free food drew in customers who might otherwise have gone elsewhere. or simply had a single drink before moving on. Historians still debate how free these lunches really were. In some establishments, particularly in larger cities, the spread could be quite elaborate, ranging from hot soups and stews to roast meats and even seafood. In such cases, there was typically an unspoken expectation that patrons would purchase multiple drinks or leave a generous tip. In frontier saloons, the offerings were usually more modest, but the principle remained the same. You notice that the bartender keeps a careful eye on the free lunch table, and when a young man helps himself to a substantial portion without ordering a drink, he receives a pointed stare until he sheepishly approaches the bar and orders a beer. Some fellas would eat you out of business if you let M, the bartender explains when he returns to your end of the bar. Rule is simple. You buy drinks, you get food. You just want food. Mrs. Holloway's kitchen is that way, and you pay cash. The free lunch served another important function in frontier communities. It was sometimes the only reliable source of nutrition for men down on their luck, in mining towns especially, where fortunes could change overnight. The saloon's free lunch could be the difference between eating and going hungry for those who could scrape together enough for a cheap drink. Back in '73, during the Silver Panic, an older miner tells you, overhearing your questions about the free lunch, half the boys in Virginia City were living off free lunch counters. One drink nursed all afternoon, and you could fill your belly enough to keep going. Saved a lot of proud men from having to beg. This social welfare aspect of the free lunch is often overlooked in historical accounts, but it represented an important safety net in communities that had few formal charitable institutions. It wasn't uncommon for saloon owners to look the other way when down-on-their-luck regulars consumed more food than their drink. Purchases would justify a form of community support that maintained men's dignity while helping them through hard times. The variety found on free lunch counters varied dramatically by location and the prosperity of the surrounding community. In cattle towns during shipping season, when cowboys had cash to spend, the spreads might include quality roast beef and fresh bread. In remote mining camps during the off-season, offerings might be limited to hardtack, jerky, and whatever game could be hunted locally. Best free lunch I ever saw was at the Silver Dollar in Denver. Reminisces, a well-dressed gambler, joining the conversation. Had oysters brought in by rail, fresh daily. Caviar sometimes. Of course, the house minimum was $1 a drink, so it wasn't exactly free by most standards. Imported delicacies did indeed make appearances on more upscale free lunch counters. Oysters were particularly popular, as they traveled relatively well when packed in ice or sold in canned form. In San Francisco and other coastal cities, the free lunch might include local seafood, while in inland territories, preserved fish and shellfish were status symbols that demonstrated a saloon's connections and prosperity. You notice something else interesting about the free lunch setup. It's designed for standing consumption. There are no tables or chairs specifically devoted to the free lunch counter. Patrons are expected to grab a bite while standing at the bar or between hands of cards. This discouraged lingering too long over the food without ordering additional drinks. In the summer, we get more variety. The bartender tells you, noticing your continued interest in the free lunch. Local farmers bring in produce they can't sell otherwise. Trade for drinks or just to get their name known. Had watermelon last August, cut it up on the bar with a Bowie knife. Place was packed for 3 days straight. This casual comment reveals another aspect of the free lunch, its role in local commerce and agricultural distribution. In an era before reliable refrigeration and transportation, the saloon could serve as an impromptu market for excess local produce, benefiting both the growers and the establishment. The free lunch also reflected the multicultural nature of frontier communities. Depending on the dominant immigrant populations in a given area, you might find German sausages, Italian salamis, Mexican chilies, or Chinese preserved vegetables alongside American staples. These ethnic additions often became integrated into the broader food culture of the region. Chinese place down the street does a different kind of free lunch. Mentions a freight driver who's been listening to the conversation. Serve it with tea instead of whiskey. Got these little dumplings that'll make you forget your own name. They're so good. While technically not saloons in the American sense, many frontier communities had equivalent establishments catering to specific immigrant populations, each with their own versions of the free lunch concept. These cultural variations added to the rich tapestry of frontier culinary traditions. By the early 1900s, the heyday of the free lunch was coming to an end. Increased regulation of saloons, rising food costs, and changing social attitudes all contributed to its decline. The final blow came with Prohibition in 1920, which forced the closure of legal saloons altogether. But during its prime, the free lunch was a central institution of frontier drinking culture, one that combined shrewd business strategy with community support in a uniquely American blend of capitalism and compassion. It was, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of frontier pragmatism. Everyone got something they needed, whether it was food, drink, or paying customers. As you sample a piece of surprisingly sharp cheese from the free lunch counter, you realize that this modest spread represents far more than just complimentary food. It's a physical manifestation of the frontier saloon's role as a multifaceted community institution, one that provided not just drinks, but nutrition, social welfare, and economic opportunity in communities that often had few formal structures for any of these functions. As evening fully settles in, the saloon's atmosphere shifts subtly. The lighting seems dimmer, the conversations more animated. You notice men gathering in small groups, their discussions more intense than the casual banter of earlier hours. Money changes hands, contracts are scribbled on scraps of paper, and handshakes seal agreements with more authority than any modern legal document. You've stumbled upon one of the frontier saloon's most vital but least acknowledged functions, its role as an informal business hub and center of frontier commerce. Far more than just a place to drink, the saloon served as stock exchange, real estate office, employment bureau, and political headquarters all rolled into one smoky, whiskey-scented package. See those fellows in the corner? The bartender nods toward a table where three men in varying qualities of attire are huddled over what appears to be a hand-drawn map. Cattle buyer from Chicago, local rancher, and the fellow in the buckskins is a trail guide. Been working out the details of a cattle drive all afternoon. Probably moving 5,000 head to the railhead next month. This scene was repeated countless times across the frontier, where the saloon functioned as the primary location for business negotiations. In communities that often lacked formal office spaces, courthouses, or even reliable postal service, the saloon provided a known location where people could meet, negotiate, and finalize arrangements. What are they drinking? You ask, noticing that the trio seems to be nursing the same glasses they've apparently had for some time. Kentucky bourbon, the good stuff, the bartender replies, but they ain't here for the drinking. They're here because everybody knows where to find everybody else. Man wants to do business in this town. He comes here first. This pragmatic approach to alcohol as social lubricant, rather than the primary purpose of gathering, was common across the frontier. Contemporary accounts suggest that many business-focused patrons consumed far less alcohol than the stereotypical image of frontier drinking would suggest, often nursing a single drink for an entire afternoon of negotiations. You watch as the cattle buyer pulls out a substantial roll of bills, counts out several $100s, and passes it to the rancher, who spits in his palm before offering a handshake to seal the deal. No lawyers, no contracts, no paperwork, just a handshake agreement backed by a man's reputation and the community's expectation of fair dealing. "Word is bond out here," explains an older man who's been watching the transaction with interest. Man breaks a handshake deal. He might as well pack up and move on. Nobody'll do business with him again. This informal system of commerce relied heavily on reputation and community enforcement of norms, both centered around the saloon as the public space where such reputations were made, maintained, or destroyed. A man known to honor his word could operate largely on credit and verbal agreements, while one who broke faith quickly found himself unable to function in the business community. Across the room, another type of commerce is taking place. A well-dressed man with a ledger is seated at a table, meeting with a succession of rough-looking miners. Each sits briefly, discusses something with animated gestures, and either leaves looking satisfied or storms off in apparent frustration. Paymaster for the Golden Vein Mine, the bartender identifies him, following your gaze, comes in every Friday to distribute wages, saves the miners a trip up to the company office, and guarantees most of that money flows straight back into my till. He grins at this efficient arrangement. This practice of conducting payroll in saloons was common throughout mining regions, creating a direct pipeline from company coffers to the saloon cash register. Mining companies weren't oblivious to this flow of capital. Many actually owned or had financial interests in the saloons where their workers drank, creating a circular economy that kept money within the corporate ecosystem. The politics happens later. The bartender continues, lowering his voice. Mayor always stops by around 9. Judge Thompson be with him. They'll take that back table and suddenly everybody with a problem or a petition knows exactly where to find them. This casual comment highlights another critical function of the frontier saloon, its role as unofficial city hall and political headquarters. In communities where formal governance was often minimal and public buildings scarce, the saloon served as the de facto center of political activity. Election campaigns were launched from saloon back rooms, local ordinances debated at the bar, and informal town meetings conducted in the larger establishments. Political appointments were often decided over drinks, with the saloon owner frequently wielding significant influence as a community leader and economic stakeholder. Last election, both candidates sat up in opposite corners, recalls an elderly patron, chuckling at the memory. Buying drinks for supporters, making speeches, nearly came to blows when the votes were counted right here at the bar. Thompson won by 3 votes, and Mackenzie claimed the bartender miscounted on purpose. This anecdote reflects the highly localized and personal nature of frontier politics, where elections might involve only a few dozen voters in smaller settlements, and where the saloon served as polling place, campaign headquarters, and election commission all in one. The political function of saloons extended beyond local governance to larger territorial and even national issues. News traveled along the same routes as whiskey shipments, and saloons became information hubs where newspapers were shared, telegrams posted, and travelers questioned for the latest news from back east or other settlements. You hear about that business in the territorial legislature. One man asks another at the bar. They're talking about moving the capital again. Palmer's buying drinks for anyone who'll sign his petition to keep it where it is. These informal political discussions formed the backbone of frontier democracy, with the saloon providing both the physical space for debate and the social lubrication that helped diverse communities find common ground. Historians still debate how democratic these processes really were, given that they largely excluded women and sometimes certain ethnic or racial groups. but within their limitations, they represented a distinctly American approach to community governance. The business functions of the saloon weren't limited to high-level deals and politics. For ordinary workers, the saloons served as employment bureau and labor exchange. A man looking for work knew that saloons were where foremen came to recruit, where job information was shared, and where recommendations could be secured. You notice a chalkboard near the door with several notices scrawled in different handwritings. Needed to experienced miners. $3 day. Ask for Jenkins at Golden Vein. Cattle drive, leaving Tuesday. 3 riders wanted. Must have own horse. Williams Ranch. Cook needed at logging camp. $75 month plus room and board. This informal job board was a common feature in frontier saloons, providing a central clearinghouse for employment opportunities for transient workers without fixed addresses or access to newspapers. These postings were often their primary source of job information. Half the work contracts in the territory are drawn up right here at my bar. The bartender tells you with evident pride. Man needs workers. He comes here. Man needs work. Same thing. Saved more men from starving than the church ever did. This practical approach to the saloon's social function was typical of frontier pragmatism in environments where survival often hung in the balance. Institutions that served multiple community needs were particularly valued, regardless of more genteel Eastern attitudes about the morality of drinking establishments. As the evening progresses, you observe another economic function of the saloon, its role as bank and currency exchange. The bartender cashes several checks for miners, taking a small percentage as his fee. A cattle buyer exchanges gold dust for paper currency, carefully weighing the precious metal on a small scale kept beneath the bar. No bank within 60 miles, explains a well-dressed gambler who notices your interest in these transactions. Bartender's got the only safe in town, probably holding half the ready cash in the county in that iron box behind the bar. In communities without formal banking institutions, saloon owners often provided basic financial services, holding valuables for safekeeping, extending credit to reliable customers, changing currency, and even making small loans. These functions further cemented the saloon's central role in frontier economic life. The social lubrication provided by alcohol was not incidental to these various business functions, it was integral to them. In a society where men from wildly different backgrounds, educations, and social classes needed to strike deals and form working relationships, alcohol served as a social equalizer and tension reducer. Fascinating thing about whiskey, observes the elderly man who's been nursing the same drink all evening, is how it loosens a man's thinking while convincing him he's being clever. Seen more creative business solutions come out of 3 fingers of bourbon than from all the sober boardrooms back east. This insight captures an often overlooked aspect of frontier commerce, the role of alcohol in facilitating the creative problem-solving and risk-taking that frontier development required. In environments where conventional approaches often failed, the social and cognitive effects of moderate alcohol consumption sometimes contributed to the innovative thinking needed to overcome frontier challenges. As you continue observing the complex social and economic ecosystem of the saloon, you realize that the frontier drinking establishment was far more than a place of vice or simple recreation. It was perhaps the most multifunctional and essential institution in many frontier communities, providing services that would later be distributed among banks, courthouses, city halls, employment agencies, and social clubs in more developed societies. As the evening deepens, the saloon door swings open to reveal a sight that causes several conversations to halt momentarily. Two women enter. Dressed in fine but slightly gaudy attire, Their dresses are more colorful than what you'd expect to see on respectable frontier women, with lower necklines and tighter bodices, though not nearly as revealing as Hollywood would have you believe. Lizzie, Frenchie, the bartender nods in greeting. The usual. The women make their way to the bar with practiced confidence, seemingly untroubled by being the only females in the establishment. Several men offer greetings, others avert their eyes, and a few make space at the bar with exaggerated courtesy. You've just encountered another aspect of frontier saloon culture that's been simultaneously mythologized and misunderstood. The presence of women in these predominantly male spaces. The reality of female participation in saloon culture was far more complex and nuanced than the simplistic, soiled dove narratives popular in Western fiction. "Those are saloon girls," explains your neighboring patron in a low voice, noticing your interest. Not quite the same as the sporting women over at Miss Mabel's place on the edge of town, if you take my meaning. This distinction was crucial in frontier communities, where different categories of working women occupied specific social niches with their own codes and expectations. The term saloon girl, or sometimes dance hall girl or beer slinger, generally referred to women employed by the establishment to entertain, dance with, and encourage drinks from male patrons, not necessarily to provide sexual services. The two women receive their drinks, something that appears to be watered down whiskey or tea disguised as whiskey, and begins circulating through the room. They chat briefly with various groups of men, laughing at jokes, inquiring about recent fortunes or misfortunes, and generally creating an atmosphere of sociability. "Ladies get a commission," the bartender explains, seeing your continued observation. 25 cents for every drink a gent buys them, plus whatever tips come their way for conversation or a dance later when the piano player returns. This commission system, known as pretty waiter girl work in some regions, was the economic foundation of the saloon girl's employment. Her job was fundamentally to increase the establishment's liquor sales by encouraging patrons to buy drinks, both for themselves and for her. The drinks served to the women were often non-alcoholic or heavily watered down, known as tea water in the parlance of the day, allowing them to remain sober while appearing to drink with customers. Miss Lizzie calls out a well-dressed cattle buyer. "Come, tell us about that new shipment of dresses you heard about on the stage yesterday." The woman called Lizzie makes her way to his table, engaging the group in animated conversation about the latest fashions reportedly arriving from St. Louis. You notice that she stands rather than sits, maintaining a certain professional distance despite the friendly banter. This scene highlights an often overlooked function of saloon girls. They served as connections to respectable society and bearers of news, gossip, and cultural information that was otherwise inaccessible to many frontier men. In communities where respectable women were scarce and male-female social interaction outside of marriage was limited, saloon girls provided conversation and female companionship that many men desperately missed. "Ain't been home in 3 years," confides a weathered miner to Frenchie, the second saloon girl, who's now standing near your end of the bar. "Just nice to talk to a lady who smells better than my mining partners." This comment earns him a sympathetic smile and a brief touch on the shoulder. Small gestures of human connection in a harsh, often lonely environment. Historians still debate the exact social status of saloon girls in frontier communities. They occupied a middle ground between respectable women and prostitutes, what some scholars have termed the semi-respectable class. While their morals were considered questionable by Victorian standards, many maintained strict boundaries around their work and were respected within their communities for their self-sufficiency and business acumen. Frenchie used to be a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania, the bartender tells you quietly. Husband died of cholera on the journey west. She's sending money back east to her sister's kids every month. Don't judge too quick. Frontier's hard on everybody, especially women without men to provide. These complex personal histories were common among frontier saloon women, many of whom turned to the profession out of economic necessity rather than choice. Widowhood, abandonment, or family financial crises drove many women to seek the relatively lucrative work in saloons, when few other employment options existed for females in frontier economies. The earnings could indeed be substantial compared to other female occupations. While a domestic servant might earn $2 to $3 per week plus room and board, and a factory girl back east $3 to $6 weekly, a successful saloon girl could make $10 or more per week through commissions and tips, though this came without the security or respectability of more conventional employment. Ladies, there's a gentleman here who might appreciate some company. The bartender calls, nodding in your direction. Lizzie approaches, carrying what appears to be a whiskey but smells suspiciously like tea when she arrives at your side. First time in town, stranger? She asks with practiced charm. I always like hearing stories from back east. Everything out here is the same day after day. Dust, miners, and bad whiskey. She laughs, revealing a glimpse of genuine weariness beneath the professional cheerfulness. This brief interaction reveals another, often forgotten, aspect of saloon girls' work. They served as audiences for men's stories, aspirations, and complaints, providing emotional outlets in environments where stoicism was otherwise expected. Many accounts from the period describe men spending substantial sums simply to have someone listen to their hopes or sorrows, a form of informal therapy facilitated by alcohol and the unique social position of saloon women. The piano player returns from his break and begins a lively tune. Several men immediately approach Lizzie and Frenchie with requests to dance in the small open area near the piano. This dancing, usually waltzers or other respectable partner dances, rather than the can-can or other provocative performances depicted in films, was another service provided by saloon girls who might charge 75 cents to $1 per dance. What's striking to modern sensibilities is how relatively tame these interactions were by contemporary standards. Despite their questionable status, frontier saloon girls typically maintained careful boundaries around physical contact, limited to dancing, perhaps a hand on an arm, or sitting beside a patron, with more intimate contact negotiated separately, if at all, and usually outside the main saloon environment. Some places run different operations, the bartender explains, seeing your continued interest in the social dynamics. Mining camps with no respectable women for 100 miles. Those saloons might have private rooms upstairs. But a town like this, with church ladies and a school, Miss Mabel's place on the edge of town handles that business, keeps things cleaner for everybody. This separation of drinking establishments from prostitution was increasingly common in more established frontier communities, particularly after 1870 as Victorian moral standards extended westward with increased settlement and the arrival of more families. The fully integrated sporting house combining saloon, gambling, and prostitution became more rare in all but the most remote or wild settlements. Not all female presence in saloons was professional, however. You notice a woman enter through a side door, plainly but neatly dressed. Clearly not a saloon girl, who speaks briefly with the bartender before he hands her a small package wrapped in paper. Mrs. Peterson, he explains, after she leaves. Husband drinks up the housekeeping money every month. I set aside a portion of his wages when he gets paid. She comes to collect it before he can spend it all. Been doing it for years. This arrangement highlights another little discussed aspect of frontier saloons. Their sometimes surprising role in supporting family economies and mitigating the negative effects of male drinking culture. Many saloon keepers established informal systems to protect family interests, whether by limiting credit, setting aside portions of wages, or refusing to serve men known to become abusive when drunk. The relationship between frontier women and saloon culture extended beyond these direct interactions. The temperance movement, predominantly led by and composed of women, was gaining significant traction during this period, presenting the first serious challenge to the saloon's cultural dominance. There was a temperance meeting at the church last Sunday, Frenchie mentions during a lull in the dancing. Mrs. Judge Thompson, leading the charge again, says they'll have this place closed by Christmas. She laughs, but there's a note of genuine concern in her voice. The conflict between predominantly female temperance advocates and predominantly male drinking culture represented one of the central social tensions of the frontier era. The saloon was increasingly portrayed by reformers as the enemy of the family, a drain on resources, and a source of violence and disorder. Characterizations that contained elements of truth alongside significant exaggeration for moral effect. For women like Lizzie and Frenchie, this tension created particular challenges. As employees of the very establishments targeted by temperance reformers, they faced growing social stigma and disapproval from respectable women in their communities, even as economic necessity kept them in their professions. "We're all just trying to survive out here," Lizzie tells a young miner who asks about her feelings regarding the temperance ladies. "They've got their husbands and homes. Not all of us were so lucky. Judge me when you've walked in these dancing shoes for a night." This pragmatic perspective was common among frontier saloon women, who often viewed their occupation as a practical economic choice rather than a moral failing. Many maintained their dignity and self-respect despite social disapproval, creating their own codes of conduct and ethical boundaries within the constraints of their circumstances. As the evening progresses, you notice Lizzie quietly helping an elderly miner count his money and put most of it in an envelope addressed to someone back east, likely family. Frenchie discreetly signals the bartender when a young cowboy appears to have had too much to drink, resulting in him being cut off despite his protests. These small acts of community care reveal the complex role that saloon women played in frontier society, simultaneously objects of desire and moral concern, businesswomen and caregivers, outsiders to respectable society, yet integral to the social fabric of their communities. Their presence in the predominantly male space of the saloon represented both the opportunities and constraints that the frontier offered to women seeking independence in a society still defined by rigid gender expectations. The saloon has grown louder as the evening deepens, with conversations in multiple languages reaching your ears. At the far end of the bar, a group of men are speaking rapid-fire German. Near the piano, two miners converse in what sounds like Welsh. Behind you, a heated debate about mining claims switches fluidly between Spanish and English. You've just noticed another fundamental aspect of frontier saloons that's often overlooked in popular portrayals. They were remarkably multicultural spaces, serving as meeting grounds where America's diverse immigrant populations intermingled, exchanged ideas, and influenced each other's drinking traditions. "This territory's a regular Tower of Babel," the bartender comments, noticing your attention to the linguistic diversity. Got Germans, Irish, Cornish miners, Mexicans, Chinese, working the railroad, even some Swedes up in the timber camps. Everybody drinks different, but everybody drinks. This casual observation captures a fundamental truth about frontier saloons. They were often the most integrated public spaces in communities that were otherwise informally segregated by national origin. While immigrants might live in distinct neighborhoods or work in specific industries, the saloon provided common ground where diverse groups could interact socially. You glance at the bottles behind the bar with renewed interest, noticing the variety that reflects this cultural diversity. Besides the expected whiskies and beers, you spot bottles labeled as tequila, schnapps, aquavit, and what appears to be rice wine. Man drinks what he knew back home, the bartender explains. Irish want their whiskey, Germans their beer, Mexicans their tequila or mezcal. Smart Saloon keeps a little of everything. This pragmatic approach to serving diverse clientele led to a remarkable cross-pollination of drinking traditions across the frontier. Beverages that had been specific to particular cultural groups gradually became more widely consumed as patrons encountered and developed tastes for drinks from other traditions. A perfect example of this cultural exchange can be seen when the bartender serves a drink called a Shanghai Punch to a well-dressed Easterner who's just arrived. The concoction involves whiskey, sugar, hot water, and, surprisingly, a splash of tea with lemon, reflecting Chinese influence on Western drinking customs. Learned that one from the Chinese cook at the railroad camp, the bartender tells you, used to serve tea with everything. Tried it with whiskey, and it caught on. The lemon helps when somebody's fighting a cold, too. This medicinal justification for cross-cultural drinking innovations was common on the frontier, where practical benefits often overrode cultural prejudices. Beverages and drinking customs that provided perceived health benefits or suited the harsh frontier environment were adopted regardless of their origins. The German contingent at the bar orders another round of beer, but you notice they're drinking it differently than the American patrons, from ceramic steins rather than glasses, and with a ritualistic toast before drinking. These cultural differences in drinking etiquette persisted even as the beverages themselves became more universally consumed. Proceed, they call out in unison before taking synchronized drinks, a small piece of old-world tradition maintained in the frontier setting. The Irish miners in the corner have their own rituals, raising glasses with calls of slate. Their preferred whiskey is differently styled than the American versions, a fact the bartender acknowledges by keeping special bottles for his Irish customers. Irish won't touch the local stuff if they can help it, he explains. Like their whiskey triple distilled and smoother, pay extra for imports from Dublin when they can get it. These preferences weren't just matters of taste, but expressions of cultural identity and connection to distant homelands. For immigrants facing the challenges and dislocations of frontier life, maintaining traditional drinking customs provided comfort and continuity amid rapid change. A Mexican vaquero approaches the bar and orders mezcal can gusano, mezcal with the traditional worm. The bartender produces a dusty bottle with the promised worm clearly visible at the bottom, causing several nearby American patrons to grimace in disgust. Don't knock it till you've tried it, the bartender advises the skeptical onlookers. Got properties that'll cure what ails you and prevent what might ail you tomorrow. This attribution of special, medicinal or spiritual properties to culturally specific alcohols was common, adding an element of mystique to unfamiliar beverages. Even the glassware reflects cultural diversity. Besides the German steins, you notice tiny cups for Chinese rice wine, short glasses for Mexican spirits, and sturdy mugs for Norwegian aqua. These vessels weren't just practical containers but carriers of cultural tradition, each shape and size, designed for specific beverages and drinking customs. Swedish fella up at the logging camp taught me about this one. The bartender tells a curious patron, producing a bottle of clear liquid labeled as akvidit. Gotta drink it ice cold, all at once, after singing some song I can't pronounce. Flavored with caraway and herbs. Puts hair on your chest and fire in your belly. These cross-cultural drinking lessons were crucial to a bartender's success on the frontier. Those who could serve each cultural group according to their traditions and preferences earned loyal customers and facilitated the social mixing that characterized frontier saloons at their best. The cultural exchange wasn't limited to the drinks themselves, but extended to the foods that accompanied them. The free lunch counter now includes tortillas alongside bread, sauerkraut beside pickles, and chorizo next to salted ham, a culinary reflection of the diverse clientele. Learned a trick from the Italian miners, the bartender mentions as he slices cured sausage for the free lunch. They soak bread in red wine before eating it. Tried it with whiskey and our sourdough. Not half bad when you're hungry enough. These culinary fusions developed organically as different immigrant groups shared space and influenced each other's consumption habits. The frontier saloon served as a laboratory for cultural exchange, with successful combinations spreading rapidly through the network of establishments that stretched across the Western territories. Even drinking games and bar entertainment reflected this multicultural influence. A group of miners in the corner are playing Finger Mora, an Italian hand game that involves guessing the total number of fingers displayed by players. At another table, German settlers have organized a drinking song competition that has attracted participants from various nationalities, each contributing verses from their native traditions. Dance nights, where you really see the mixing, comments an older patron, nodding toward the currently empty dance floor. Start with a Virginia reel, move to a German waltz, end with a Mexican fandango. Everybody learns everybody else's steps eventually. This dance floor integration represented one of the most visible forms of cultural exchange in frontier communities. Despite language barriers and occasional tensions, shared music and movement created connections that transcended national origins. Not all cultural interactions in the saloon were harmonious, of course. You overhear a heated argument between an Irish miner and a Cornish counterpart about the proper way to drink whiskey, neat or with water added. What begins as a technical disagreement quickly reveals deeper historical antagonisms carried from the old world to the new. Some feuds come west with the men who carry them, the bartender sighs, moving casually to separate the increasingly agitated arguers. Irish and Cornish, English and Welsh, Germans from different provinces. They brought their old quarrels along with their drinking songs. These tensions reflected the complex reality of frontier multiculturalism, a process that included conflict and prejudice, alongside cooperation and exchange. The saloon contained these contradictions, sometimes exacerbating divisions through alcohol-fueled arguments, but more often creating space where different groups could find common ground. Perhaps the most significant cultural exchange occurred through language itself. You notice that many of the non-English speakers switch fluidly between their native tongues and frontier English, particularly when ordering drinks or joining broader conversations. The saloon functioned as an informal language school, where immigrants learned practical English through the universal medium of shared drinking. Teach me how to order beer in German, requests a young American cowboy to his German neighbor at the bar, who happily obliges with a pronunciation lesson for ein Bier, bit. The cowboy practices several times, gaining corrections and eventually earning approving nods from the entire German contingent when he masters it. These casual language exchanges facilitated both practical communication and cultural understanding. Drinking vocabulary, terms for beverages, toasts, and drinking customs often formed the first shared lexicon between immigrant groups and English-speaking Americans. The bartender himself embodies this cultural fusion, switching languages with practiced ease as he serves his diverse clientele. Learned bits and pieces of 8 languages, tending bar, he tells you. Can't write a letter in any of them, but I can take a man's order and tell when he's had enough, no matter where he's from. This linguistic flexibility was a valuable skill in frontier communities, where successful business depended on serving diverse populations. Bartenders who could communicate across cultural lines became important community figures, often serving as informal translators and cultural brokers beyond their role as drink providers. As midnight approaches, the diverse crowd begins a surprisingly unified ritual. A round of drinks raised together while someone plays Home Sweet Home on the piano. Despite their different origins, the patrons share the universal experience of displacement and longing for distant homes, an emotional reality that transcended cultural differences and found expression through shared drinking customs. In this moment, you glimpse the Frontier Saloon's most profound function as a multicultural space. It provided a place where displaced people from across America and around the world could create new communities and traditions, while maintaining connections to their diverse origins. The drinks they shared were more than mere alcohol. They were vessels of cultural memory and adaptation, carrying old traditions into new contexts and facilitating the complex process of becoming American without entirely ceasing to be Irish, German, Mexican, or Chinese. As the night deepens, you notice a miner limping into the saloon, his face contorted with pain. Without a word, the bartender reaches beneath the counter and produces a bottle different from those used for regular drinks. This one, with a handwritten label reading Old Doc's Remedy. Lumbago, acting up again. Pete, the bartender asks, pouring a generous measure into a clean glass. The miner nods, gratefully. Can't hardly stand straight. That shaft gets colder and damper every year. He drinks the liquid in a single swallow, grimacing at the taste, but sighing with apparent relief moments later. You've just witnessed another fascinating and often overlooked aspect of frontier saloons, their function as informal pharmacies and medical treatment centers. Long before modern regulations separated alcoholic beverages from medications, the line between drinking for pleasure and drinking for health was remarkably blurred. What was in that? You ask the bartender after the miner makes his way to a table, moving noticeably easier than when he entered. Whiskey base, with willow bark, some laudanum, touch of peppermint to make it go down easier, the bartender replies, matter-of-factly. Not as good as what the real doctor would prescribe, but he's 30 miles from here, and Pete can't afford him anyway. This casual dispensing of medicinal alcohol mixtures was standard practice in frontier saloons, where bartenders often served as de facto pharmacists in communities with limited or no professional medical care. The practice had deep historical roots. For centuries, alcoholic preparations had been the primary method of delivering medicinal compounds, and this tradition continued on the American frontier. Most common request is for the bartender's cure, he continues, seeing your interest. Whiskey, hot water, lemon if we have it, honey, and a dash of bitters. Works for colds, coughs, and getting over a hard night's drinking. He smiles at this last application. These hot whiskey drinks, variously called hot toddies, hot whiskey punches, or simply the cure, were indeed among the most popular medicinal preparations served in frontier saloons. They combined the perceived warming and stimulating properties of alcohol with various additives believed to address specific symptoms. Another patron approaches, a young man looking pale and shaky. Got something for a man who can't keep his breakfast down 3 days running? He asks quietly. Without hesitation, the bartender mixes a concoction involving bitters, a raw egg, and what appears to be brandy rather than whiskey. Sip it slow, he advises. Doctor's orders. This reference to doctor's orders wasn't entirely facetious. Many of these bar remedies had origins in legitimate medical practice of the era, where alcohol was widely prescribed for everything from digestive issues to respiratory ailments. Professional physicians commonly recommended specific alcoholic preparations, which patients would then obtain from saloons rather than pharmacies in communities where the latter were unavailable. Most of these recipes came from old Doc Murray before he passed. The bartender explains, "Taught me which mixtures work for different complaints. Said I'd save more lives with good medicinal whiskey than he ever did with his surgeon's tools." This informal medical education of bartenders by physicians was surprisingly common on the frontier. Doctors, recognizing the bartender's role as the most accessible source of treatment in remote communities, would often provide basic training and specific formulations to ensure that common ailments could be addressed when professional care was unavailable. The range of conditions treated with saloon remedies was remarkably broad. You observe different patrons throughout the evening seeking relief for rheumatism and joint pain treated with whiskey infused with hot peppers, coughs and chest congestion addressed with honey, whiskey, and sometimes pine resin, digestive complaints handled with bitters-heavy mixtures or ginger-infused spirits, toothaches numbed with high-proof alcohol applied directly or held in the mouth wounds, and infections cleaned with alcohol and sometimes covered with alcohol-soaked bandages, sleep difficulties addressed with sedative-laced nightcaps. "Lady came in yesterday through the back door," the bartender tells you in a lower voice. "Respectable type, wouldn't normally set foot in here. Needed something for her monthly troubles. Fixed her up with a blackberry brandy mixture. Works every time, so they say." This discreet service to women with gynecological complaints highlights the saloon's sometimes surprising role in addressing comprehensive community health needs, including those that social conventions made difficult to discuss openly. For women without access to female physicians, which were rare, or midwives, the bartender's medicinal knowledge could provide relief for conditions that would otherwise go untreated. The relationship between alcohol and medicine on the frontier was complicated by the limited scientific understanding of the era. While alcohol was valued for its genuine properties as a solvent extracting medicinal compounds from herbs and roots, a mild anesthetic, and a vasodilator, its perceived benefits were often exaggerated based on its immediate effects rather than long-term outcomes. Best medicine and worst poison, depending on how you use it, observes an elderly man who identifies himself as a retired army surgeon. Seen it save men from shock after injuries, then kill the same men years later when they couldn't stop drinking it. This ambivalence about alcohol's medical properties was reflected in the emerging medical literature of the late 19th century, which began to question alcohol's previously uncontested status as a medicinal staple. These debates would eventually contribute to the temperance movement and prohibition. But on the frontier, practical considerations typically outweighed theoretical concerns. "Most important medicine out here isn't for the body anyway," the bartender comments philosophically as he prepares another round of drinks for a table of miners. "It's for the spirit. Men come in beaten down by sun, wind, bad luck, and loneliness. Leave standing a little straighter with some hope in their eyes. Can't measure that kind of healing, but it's real all the same." This psychological dimension of alcohol as medicine represents perhaps its most significant role in frontier communities. In environments characterized by physical hardship, social isolation, and high rates of failure and disappointment, the temporary relief provided by drinking offered an emotional salve that few other institutions could provide. Not all medicinal drinking was self-administered or bartender prescribed. You notice the actual town doctor enter the saloon, looking exhausted after what was apparently a difficult delivery at a nearby ranch. He nods to the bartender, who immediately pours him a specific mixture without being asked. "Doc's special," the bartender explains. "Brandy base, with coca extract and a dash of morphine tincture. Only mix it for him and only after he's done with patients for the day. Says it's the only thing that lets him sleep after the hard cases." This casual mention of coca and morphine highlights another aspect of frontier medicinal drinking. the frequent inclusion of what would now be considered controlled substances before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. Ingredients like cocaine from coca leaf, opium derivatives, and various potent herbal compounds were standard components of both commercial and homemade medicinal preparations, the most famous commercial products blurring these lines between medicine and recreational drink were the various bitters prominently displayed behind the bar. Originally developed as medicinal tonics, products like Hostatas, stomach bitters, 40% alcohol, Angostura bitters, 44.7% alcohol, and Drake's Plantation bitters, around 33% alcohol, were consumed both as standalone health treatments and as ingredients in recreational cocktails. "This one's from the Washoe Indians," the bartender says, showing you a small bottle containing a dark liquid, willow bark, sage, and local herbs steeped in whiskey. "Best thing for headaches I've ever found. Tribe's medicine woman taught me how to prepare it properly. Timing matters as much as ingredients." This incorporation of indigenous medicinal knowledge into frontier drinking practices was common across the West. Native American herbal traditions were often adapted by settlers and combined with European alcohol-based preparations, creating hybrid remedies that drew from multiple healing traditions. The reality of these various remedies' effectiveness was mixed. Some, like willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, had genuine medicinal properties. Others worked primarily through the placebo effect, or the short-term physiological impacts of alcohol itself. The most questionable relied on addictive ingredients that created dependency while masking rather than treating underlying conditions. "Had a fellow come through selling Electric Vigor tonic last month," the bartender recalls with a chuckle. "Claimed it could cure everything from baldness to masculine weakness. Tested it myself. Just cheap whiskey with chili pepper and probably some Spanish fly. Sent him packing before he could poison anyone." This skepticism toward commercial patent medicines was common among experienced bartenders, who often served as the community's first line of defense against fraudulent health products. Having developed practical knowledge of which preparations actually helped their patrons, they could distinguish between legitimate remedies and dangerous or ineffective nostrums. As closing time approaches, you watch the bartender prepare one final medicinal mixture, a prevention rather than a cure. He sets out several glasses of a murky concoction for the miners heading to their overnight shift. "Fortification for the night workers," he explains. "Whiskey with coffee, raw egg, and molasses. Keeps them warm in the tunnels and helps them stay alert." Not official company policy, but the foreman looks the other way. Fewer accidents when the men are fortified but not drunk. This practical approach to using alcohol's properties while mitigating its disadvantages typified frontier attitudes toward medicinal drinking, far from the simplistic drink as much as possible stereotype. Many frontier consumers and servers of alcohol developed nuanced practices that attempted to maximize benefits while minimizing harms in environments where perfect solutions were rarely available. As the miners down their fortification and head out into the night, you're left contemplating the complex relationship between medicine and alcohol that characterized frontier saloons, institutions that served simultaneously as pharmacies, doctors' offices, and sources of both physical and psychological relief in communities where formal medical care was often a luxury few could access. As the night wears on, you notice something unexpected. A significant number of patrons are consuming beverages that clearly aren't alcoholic at all. A miner at the end of the bar is drinking what appears to be plain coffee. A well-dressed gambler sips from a glass of water with a slice of lemon. A group of cowboys have ordered a round of something called sath. This observation challenges another fundamental. Misconception about frontier saloons. The assumption that everyone was there to get drunk on whiskey. The reality of frontier drinking was far more nuanced, with non-alcoholic options playing a surprisingly important role in saloon culture. Coffee's our second best seller after whiskey. The bartender confirms when you ask about these non-alcoholic options. Go through 15 pounds of beans a week. Some days serve more cups of coffee than shots of whiskey, especially when the weather turns cold. This prominence of coffee in frontier saloons wasn't coincidental. In remote communities where households might struggle to afford coffee beans or lack proper equipment to brew them, the saloon often served as the community coffee house, a role that has been largely forgotten in popular portrayals of Western drinking culture. Good coffee's harder to find than good whiskey out here, explains an elderly prospector nursing a steaming mug. Saloon gets the best beans off the supply wagons. Worth coming in just for that, even if you never touch a drop of spirits. The quality and consistency of saloon coffee varied widely, of course. In more established towns, saloons might serve properly brewed coffee made from freshly ground beans. In remote outposts, the coffee might be little more than twice boiled grounds, supplemented with chicory or even burnt bread to stretch limited supplies. But even this poor substitute was valued in communities where caffeine was essential fuel for dangerous, physically demanding work. Most miners drink coffee before their shift and whiskey after, the bartender explains. Need clear heads underground. One mistake from being sleepy or slow can kill a man when you're working with dynamite and timber supports. This practical approach to beverage choice reflected the realities of frontier life, where work was often dangerous and required full attention. Contrary to Hollywood depictions of perpetually drunk cowboys and miners, most working men were careful to remain sober during working hours, turning to alcohol only after their day's labor was complete. Your attention is drawn to a young cowboy ordering a glass of buttermilk, another unexpected, non-alcoholic option. The bartender serves it without comment, suggesting this isn't an unusual request. Can't hold my liquor, the cowboy explains, sheepishly, noticing your surprise. Rather be teased for drinking buttermilk than for passing out after 2 shots. Besides, riding drag tomorrow, need my wits about me. This pragmatic attitude toward alcohol consumption was common among frontier workers, many of whom recognized their own limits and the consequences of impairment in dangerous professions. Peer pressure certainly existed, but there was also a frontier pragmatism that respected a man's choice to abstain when circumstances required it. Sarsaparilla represented another popular non-alcoholic option in frontier saloons. Made from the root of the sarsaparilla plant, mixed with carbonated water and sweeteners, it provided a flavorful alternative to alcohol that still allowed patrons to participate in social drinking rituals. The temperance ladies approve of sarsaparilla, the bartender notes with a slight smile. Call it the moral drink. Sell a fair amount to young men courting respectable girls. They can tell their sweethearts they were at the saloon drinking sarsaparilla all night, and it's technically true. This social function of non-alcoholic beverages, allowing participation in saloon culture without alcohol consumption, was particularly important for younger men and those concerned about maintaining respectable reputations. The frontier saloon's role as community gathering place meant that some participation was almost necessary for social and economic integration, making non-alcoholic options essential for those who couldn't or wouldn't drink alcohol. Various forms of water also featured prominently among frontier saloon beverages. Plain water was always available, though its quality might be questionable. More popular were water variants like carbonated water, often called soda water, sometimes flavored with fruit, syrups, mineral water from local springs, valued for supposed health benefits, lemonade, or other fruit-infused waters when ingredients were available. Congress water, alkaline mineral water, thought to aid digestion, got a special spring 3 miles south of town. The bartender tells you, water's got minerals that taste terrible but fix what ails you. According to old Hank who discovered it, bring in a barrel every week for folks with stomach troubles. This medicinal approach to water consumption reflected broader 19th century beliefs about hydropathy and the healing properties of various water sources. Frontier saloons often capitalized on these beliefs, offering special waters as health tonics for those seeking alternatives to alcoholic remedies. Tea also made surprising appearances in frontier saloons, particularly in areas with significant Chinese populations or English immigrants. While not as common as coffee, various teas were valued both for everyday consumption and for specific medicinal purposes. Mining engineer from Cornwall won't drink anything but tea after 4 in the afternoon, the bartender mentions, nodding toward a well-dressed man reading a newspaper in the corner. Brings his own special blend from home. Lets me sell cups to others when he's feeling generous. These imported drinking preferences contributed to the diversity of frontier beverage culture, with saloons adapting to serve the non-alcoholic as well as alcoholic traditions of their varied clientele. Perhaps the most surprising non-alcoholic options were various forms of milk. Fresh milk was rare and highly perishable in frontier conditions, but preserved forms like buttermilk and condensed milk were relatively common saloon offerings, particularly for cowboys with sensitive stomachs after months of camp cooking. Miners seeking to counteract the effects of dust inhalation, those recovering from illness or injury. Young men not yet accustomed to alcohol-sweetened condensed milk with hot water makes a fine evening drink, an older rancher tells you. Sipping what appears to be this concoction. My doctor says alcohol aggravates my liver condition. This satisfies my sweet tooth without causing trouble. This medicinal avoidance of alcohol was another common reason for non-alcoholic consumption in frontier saloons. Before modern pharmaceuticals, dietary management was a primary treatment for many chronic conditions, with alcohol restriction frequently recommended for liver, kidney, and heart ailments. Religious reasons for abstention also played a role in creating demand for non-alcoholic options. While many frontier communities were less strictly observant than their eastern counterparts, there remained significant populations of Methodists, Baptists, Mormons, and other denominations that discouraged or prohibited alcohol consumption. The Mormon freight drivers stop here every Tuesday, the bartender explains. Good customers for coffee and sarsaparilla, never touch the whiskey, but they enjoy the company and the card games just the same. This accommodation of religious abstainers reflected the saloon's broader social function beyond just serving alcohol. As community gathering places, frontier saloons had practical incentives to welcome all potential customers, including those who wouldn't consume their most profitable products. Economic considerations also drove non-alcoholic consumption. Simply put, alcohol was expensive relative to wages, and many frontier workers couldn't afford to drink regularly or heavily. Average cowhand makes $30 a month plus board, explains a ranch foreman sitting nearby. Can't be spending $1 a day on whiskey and expect to have anything left to show for a season's work. This economic reality meant that many saloon patrons would nurse a single alcoholic, drink all evening while mostly consuming cheaper non-alcoholic options, or would visit the saloon primarily for the free lunch and social interaction, rather than for serious drinking. The bartender's willingness to serve non-drinkers without pressure or comment was not universal, but was common in more established communities. This tolerance reflected both good business sense and the practical recognition that frontier saloons needed to serve multiple social functions beyond just providing intoxication. I make less profit on a cup of coffee than a shot of whiskey, the bartender acknowledges, but a man drinking coffee might stay for hours playing cards. eating from the free lunch, and encouraging others to drink who do pay for whiskey. It all works out in the ledger book. This pragmatic approach to serving non-drinkers represented the Frontier Saloon at its best, an adaptable institution that responded to community needs rather than enforcing a single model of consumption. As closing time approaches, you notice the bartender preparing a final round of drinks for the remaining patrons. What's striking is the diversity of the order: whiskey for some, beer for others, coffee for the night workers heading to their shifts, and various non-alcoholic options for those who've had enough alcohol for the evening. A good night at the bar is like a good community, the elderly prospector observes, seeing your interest in this diverse final round. Room for every kind of thirst, every kind of man, and every kind of story. That's what keeps us coming back, not just the drinks, whatever they might be. This inclusive approach to beverage service, accommodating both drinkers and non-drinkers in the same social space, represents an aspect of Frontier Saloon culture that has been largely forgotten in popular portrayals, focused exclusively on alcohol consumption. The reality was far more nuanced, a beverage ecosystem that reflected the diverse needs, preferences, and circumstances of frontier communities where the saloon served as more than just a drinking establishment. The piano player starts a lively tune, and the atmosphere in the saloon shifts subtly. Men rearrange tables, creating more space in the center of the room, while others move toward the walls, watching with anticipation. You've noticed periodic bursts of excitement throughout the evening centered around a back corner of the establishment, where groups of men hunched intently over tables covered in green baize. Games about to get serious, the bartender informs you, nodding toward the larger table now commanding center stage. Big Pete's been winning all week. Tonight's when they try to win it back. You've encountered another fundamental aspect of Frontier Saloon culture, its role as the center of gambling and gaming activities. While Hollywood has certainly portrayed gambling as part of Western saloons, the reality was far more complex and integral to these establishments than typically depicted. Most nights, I make as much profit from the gaming tables as from the bar. The bartender continues. Take a percentage of each pot in the big games, rent table space to the small ones. Better business model than just selling drinks. This economic reality was central to understanding frontier saloons. Many operated on a hybrid business model where alcohol sales were just one revenue stream alongside gambling operations, food service, and sometimes entertainment or lodging. In remote communities with limited commercial spaces, this diversification made practical business sense. As you watch, you notice that the gambling activities are remarkably diverse, far beyond the poker games that dominate Western films. The main table is indeed hosting poker, specifically a variant called draw poker that was gaining popularity in this era. But around the room, you observe a faro table operated by a professional dealer in a green E-shade, a roulette wheel spinning in the corner, small groups playing chuck-a-luck, a dice game, and 3-card Monte, a group of Mexican vaqueros playing Monte, a Spanish card game. Several minors engaged in a Chinese gambling game using small tiles, Pharaoh's still king, explains an older gambler who notices your interest. Simple to learn, hard to master, nearly impossible to cheat at with a straight dealer. Been the favorite from Mississippi riverboats to California goldfields. This observation highlights an interesting historical reality. While poker dominates Western gambling in popular culture, Faro was actually the most widespread and popular gambling game throughout most of the frontier era. Only in the later years of the 19th century did poker begin to supplant it as the dominant card game. The complexity of the gambling ecosystem extended to the beverages that accompanied it. You notice distinct drinking patterns among different types of gamblers. The serious poker players sip occasionally from glasses of whiskey. Clearly pacing themselves, the rowdier crowd around the dice games drink beer more freely. The professional dealer at the faro table drinks only coffee. The high-stakes players at the center table are being served expensive imported brandy. Smart gambler stays sober, comments the man next to you, who introduces himself as a traveling salesman who supplements his income at the card tables. Seen many a man lose a month's wages because whiskey made him think 3 queens was invincible. This strategic approach to drinking while gambling was common among serious players, who recognized that alcohol impaired judgment and decision-making. The stereotype of gamblers drinking heavily while playing was largely a Hollywood fabrication. Professional and semi-professional gamblers typically practiced moderation or abstention while working the tables. The relationship between drinking and gambling created a complex social dynamic in frontier saloons. Proprietors wanted to sell alcohol, but didn't want patrons, so, intoxicated, they couldn't gamble effectively and continue losing money to the house. This led to unspoken but widely practiced norms around appropriate levels of intoxication for different gambling activities. House rule: the bartender tells a young miner who appears too drunk to join a card game, "No more whiskey until you've sobered up some. Coffee's on the house if you want to get back in the game faster." This mixture of business pragmatism and a certain rough paternalism characterized many frontier saloon operators' approach to managing the intersection of drinking and gambling. While happy to profit from both activities, most recognized that extreme intoxication was bad for business in the long run. The gambling itself features fascinating rituals around drinking. You watch as a player wins a substantial pot at the poker table and immediately calls out, "Drinks for the table." The bartender efficiently delivers a round to all players, with the cost deducted from the winner's new stack of chips. Tradition explains your gambling acquaintance, keeps the losers from getting too sore, keeps the game friendly, also makes it harder for the winner to leave while he's ahead. He winks at this last strategic benefit of the custom. These gambling-specific drinking rituals served important social functions beyond mere consumption. They helped manage the tensions inherent in an activity where money regularly changed hands, maintained the sociability that kept games going, and created community among players who might otherwise have little in common. The betting itself was remarkably varied, reflecting the economic diversity of frontier communities. At some tables, men gamble with small coins or even alternative currencies like gold dust or bullets. At the high-stakes center table, paper money and gold pieces change hands in amounts that represent months of wages for working men. Mining camp up north, they gamble with raw ore, an old prospector tells you. Can't judge the value exactly, so it adds another layer of gambling to the gambling, if you take my meaning. This flexibility around betting mediums was necessary in frontier economies, where conventional currency was often scarce. Saloon gambling adapted to local conditions, accepting whatever forms of value were available in a given community. You notice something else surprising. Some of the gamblers are drinking elaborate, mixed beverages rather than straight spirits. The bartender delivers a complex concoction to the main poker table, something involving whiskey, bitters, sugar, and citrus peel. Old-fashioned, he explains, seeing your interest. Gentleman's gambling drink. Lasts longer than neat whiskey. Gives your hands something to do during tense hands. And the sugar keeps your mind sharp. These gambling-specific beverages represented another adaptation of frontier drinking culture to the practical needs of different activities. Drinks were selected not just for taste or intoxicating effect, but for their suitability to the rhythm and requirements of different games. The relationship between specific games and drinking patterns becomes more apparent as you observe longer. The faro players, engaged in a game requiring quick calculations of odds, tend toward moderation or abstention. The dice players, enjoying a game of pure chance, drink more freely. The poker players carefully pace their consumption to maintain the alertness needed for strategic play while still benefiting from alcohol's social lubricating effects. Never drink while learning a new game, advises a successful-looking gambler to a younger man. Learn sober, then add whiskey once your hands know the moves, without your mind having to guide them. This sophisticated understanding of alcohol's effects on different cognitive and motor functions reflected the practical wisdom developed through frontier gambling culture. Far from the simplistic drink and play portrayal in popular media, real frontier gambling involved nuanced approaches to consumption based on game requirements and individual tolerance. The house itself has different drinking policies for different games. You notice that the roulette wheel operator actively encourages drinking, even offering free rounds to consistent players. Meanwhile, the faro dealer subtly discourages heavy consumption at his table. House edge on roulette is fixed, explains your gambling companion. Drunk players don't change the odds. Faro's different skilled player can nearly eliminate the house advantage. Saloon doesn't want sharp players getting sharper or drunk players making mistakes that cost the house money. These game-specific drinking policies reflected the complex economics of frontier gambling, where different games offered different profit margins and vulnerability to player skill. Saloon operators understood these distinctions and adjusted their service accordingly. The pace of drinking also varied with the rhythm of different games. Poker, with its periodic intense moments, separated by slower periods of dealing and betting, created natural drinking intervals. Continuous games like roulette or dice had different patterns, with players often drinking more steadily throughout. In poker, you drink between hands, observes a player taking a break from the main game. In faro, you drink between shoes. In Monte, you drink when the dealer changes. Each game has its proper drinking time. These unwritten but widely understood conventions around when to drink during different games represented another layer of frontier gambling culture's sophistication, a far cry from the chaotic free-for-all often portrayed in Western fiction. As the night deepens, you notice changes in both the gambling and drinking patterns. Games become more serious, stakes rise, and drinking generally becomes more moderate among serious players while increasing among spectators and casual participants. The bartender adjusts his service accordingly, providing coffee to some tables while continuing to serve alcohol to others. Nighttime separates the professionals from the amateurs. Your gambling acquaintance observes. Amateurs drink more as they lose. Professionals drink less as the money gets serious. By midnight, you can tell a man's skill just by what's in his glass. This evolution throughout the evening was a regular feature of frontier gambling culture, with drinking and playing patterns shifting in predictable ways as different types of patrons reached their limits, financial, physical, or in terms of alcohol tolerance, and either modified their behavior or departed. The most serious gamblers often brought their own bottles to the table, not to avoid paying saloon prices, but to ensure they weren't being served adulterated spirits that might cloud their judgment. The bartender accommodates this practice without comment, sometimes providing glasses and setups for these personal bottles. Man playing with a month's wages deserves to know exactly what he's putting in his body, comments a well-dressed gambler who's been winning consistently at the main poker table. Bring my own bourbon from Kentucky. Cost of doing business. This practice of serious gamblers supplying their own alcohol reflected both practical concerns about quality and the psychological aspects of gambling. Control over one's drinking was seen as connected to control over one's gaming fortunes. As closing time approaches, the gambling reaches its crescendo. The main poker game has winnowed down to 3 players, with stacks of money and valuable items piled in the center. Their drinking has all but stopped, with glasses of water replacing whiskey as concentration intensifies. Final hand often determines whether a man drinks in celebration or drinks to forget. The bartender observes philosophically. Either way, I pour the same whiskey. This cyclical relationship between gambling outcomes and drinking patterns was a fundamental rhythm of frontier saloon life. Wins led to celebratory rounds, losses to consolatory consumption, all keeping the economic ecosystem of the establishment in balance, regardless of which patron went home richer. As you watch the final dramatic hand play out, you realize that the intertwined activities of drinking and gambling formed the true heart of frontier saloon culture, each influencing and being influenced by the other in a complex dance of social ritual, economic exchange, and psychological strategy far more sophisticated than the simplistic portrayals that would later define the Western saloon in popular imagination. A hush falls over the saloon as the door swings open to reveal a man in a black suit, his expression somber. He speaks quietly to the bartender, who nods and reaches for a bottle kept on the highest shelf, clearly special stock reserved for particular occasions. Jeb Wilson's boy didn't make it, the bartender announces to the room. Fever took him this morning. The transformation in the saloon's atmosphere is immediate and profound. The piano player switches to a slow, mournful tune. Men remove their hats. The gambling pauses, cards set down mid-game without dispute. The bartender pours a line of whiskies along the bar, offering them without request for payment. You've encountered another essential but often overlooked function of the frontier saloon, its role as a center for community ritual, particularly around celebrations and mourning. Far more than just a place for casual drinking, the frontier saloon served as an informal community hall where the most significant events in people's lives were marked with shared consumption and ritual. To young Thomas Wilson, says an older miner, raising his glass, may he rest easier than he lived. The room echoes with murmured agreements as men drink to the memory of a child few of them likely knew personally. This impromptu wake represents one of the most important social functions of frontier saloons, providing space and structure for communal grieving in communities that often lacked formal funeral homes or sufficient church capacity. The shared consumption of alcohol served not just as comfort to the bereaved, but as a way for the broader community to acknowledge and process loss together. His father will be in later, the bartender tells you quietly. Men will buy him drinks he won't pay for, say words that won't bring comfort, but need saying anyway. It's how we manage these things out here. This practice of funeral drinks, provided free or paid for by community members, was a widespread custom across the frontier, in an era when death was both more common and more visible than in modern society. These rituals provided essential psychological support for communities regularly facing loss. The man in the black suit, apparently the closest thing the town has to an undertaker, accepts a drink of his own. Service will be tomorrow at sundown, he announces. Wilson says all are welcome who knew the boy. The saloon will play a role in this funeral process beyond just the initial announcement and wake. After the burial, many community members will return here to continue the mourning process, often transitioning gradually from solemn remembrance to celebration of the deceased's life through shared stories and, eventually, more upbeat drinking and socializing. This pattern of using the saloon as a space for processing grief reflected practical realities of frontier life. Churches were often too small for community gatherings, private homes too limited for receiving numerous visitors, and dedicated funeral establishments rare outside larger towns. The saloon, with its central location, ample space, an existing role as community gathering place, naturally filled this void, as if to emphasize the saloon's multiple ritual functions. The door opens again, this time revealing a grinning young man who announces, "It's a boy, 7 pounds, and healthy as a horse." A cheer erupts, and the bartender immediately begins pouring celebratory drinks, the mood shifting dramatically from moments before. Thompson's first son, after 4 daughters, explains a rancher standing nearby. Been waiting 7 years for a boy to inherit the ranch. This calls for the good stuff. The contrast between the morning ritual and this celebratory announcement highlights the saloon's remarkable adaptability as a space for community ritual, within the same physical environment and using the same basic medium, shared alcohol consumption. The community could process events at opposite ends of the emotional spectrum. First rounds on the house for a new Thompson, the bartender declares, producing bottles of higher quality than the standard fare. Men line up to toast the new arrival and congratulate the beaming father, who accepts both drinks and hearty backslaps with equal enthusiasm. This celebration of birth represented another important ritual function of frontier saloons. In communities without formal venues for celebration, the local drinking establishment provided the space and structure for marking life's joyous milestones. The birth drink, or wetting the baby's head, was a widespread custom, with new fathers expected to share their joy through providing drinks to friends and neighbors. Same bottles served at both events, the bartender tells you, pointing to the special reserve he's been pouring. Kentucky bourbon, aged 7 years, reserved for marriages, births, deaths, and major holidays. Some days, it sees all 4. This practical approach to ritual drinking, using the same special stock for different ceremonial purposes, reflected both the limited resources of frontier communities and a philosophical understanding that life's extremes were connected through shared community experience. The rituals extend beyond just births and deaths. As the evening progresses, you witness several other ceremonial drinking practices. A miner buys a round for the house after striking a promising new vein, a ritual of sharing good fortune to men who had been feuding drinks together after resolving their dispute. Their reconciliation formalized through shared consumption. A young man purchases his first legal drink upon turning 21, marked by special attention and advice from older patrons. A group of cowboys celebrate the end of a successful cattle drive with a coordinated drinking ritual involving specialized toasts. Out here, we don't have fancy churches or courthouses for marking life's moments, explains an elderly patron who's been observing these various rituals. What we have is this room, these bottles, and each other. Does the job well enough. This pragmatic approach to creating meaningful ritual within the available resources characterized frontier communities' use of saloons as ceremonial spaces. While Eastern society might view drinking establishments as inappropriate venues for significant life events, frontier pragmatism recognized that community needs would be met with whatever spaces and materials were available. The ceremonial function of alcohol itself was central to these rituals. Beyond its physiological effects, alcohol served as a ritual marker, something special that distinguished ordinary consumption from ceremonial sharing. Special bottles reserved for important occasions, particular drinking customs associated with specific events, and the sharing of alcohol as a form of community bonding all elevated drinking from mere consumption to meaningful ritual. When Thompson's first daughter was born, recalls a longtime resident, he couldn't afford good whiskey for everyone, bought cheap rotgut, but served it in clean glasses with a ceremony that made it taste like the finest bourbon. It's not always what you drink, but how and why you drink it that matters. This insight captures an important aspect of frontier drinking culture, the transformation of even modest alcoholic beverages into ceremonial substances through context, intention, and shared understanding. A shot of whiskey could be just a drink or a profound ritual element, depending on the circumstances of its consumption. The ritual functions extended to community-wide celebrations as well. As midnight approaches, someone reminds the room that tomorrow is Founders' Day, the anniversary of the town's establishment. The bartender announces that he'll be serving a special punch made from a recipe dating to the original settlement, continuing a tradition maintained since the community's beginning. Been making the same Founders' Day punch for 15 years, he tells you proudly. Secret recipe passed down from the first bartender in town. Not the best thing you'll ever taste, but tradition matters out here where we don't have much else to connect us to our history. This use of special drinks to mark community-wide celebrations was common across the frontier, with saloons often serving as the central venues for holiday observances, civic anniversaries, and seasonal festivals. These ceremonial drinks, whether special punches, imported beverages normally unavailable, or simply larger quantities of standard offerings, helped transform ordinary drinking into community ritual. The ceremonial aspects of frontier drinking weren't limited to special occasions, but extended to regular patterns that structured daily and weekly life. You notice that, as the night grows late, the bartender rings a small bell kept behind the bar. "Last call," he announces. "Get your final drinks, and say what needs saying before doors close." This nightly ritual, the formalized ending of the drinking day, represented another way that frontier saloons provided structure and meaning through ceremonial consumption. The last drink carried special significance, often accompanied by final toasts, resolution of outstanding matters, and preparation for the transition from public socializing to private rest. "Some nights that bell saves lives," comments an older patron. "Men hear it and remember they have somewhere to be tomorrow, something to live for beyond the bottom of the glass." Ritual reminds us we're men with purposes, not just drinkers. This recognition of ritual's role in containing and structuring drinking, preventing it from becoming endlessly destructive, represents a sophisticated understanding of alcohol's dual nature as both potential danger and meaningful social tool. Frontier drinking culture, at its best, used ritual to harness alcohol's positive social functions while limiting its harmful excesses. Weekly patterns provided another layer of ritual structure. You learn that Saturday nights feature dancing, Sunday mornings a special reviver drink for the hungover, and payday Fridays, a tradition of workers buying rounds for colleagues who helped them through difficult situations during the work period. "Payday rituals important," explains a miner waiting at the bar. "Man who helped you shore up a dangerous tunnel last week. You buy him a drink this week." Acknowledges the debt without making it about money. Keeps the community functioning. These regular, calendrical rituals created a shared rhythm of consumption that reinforced community bonds and values. Far from the stereotype of chaotic, impulsive frontier drinking, these patterns reveal a highly structured approach to alcohol consumption that served specific social purposes. As the final last call drinks are served, you notice that certain patrons receive specific beverages without having to order. The bartender knows their preferred closing ritual and provides it automatically. Some receive coffee rather than alcohol, others specific mixed drinks believed to prevent hangovers, and some a final shot of whiskey to complete their evening's consumption. Man's last drink says as much about him as his first, the bartender observes philosophically. Some need clarity before sleeping, others oblivion. Some drink to remember the day, others to forget it. I serve them all what they need, not just what they want. This personalized approach to ritual drinking highlights the frontier, Bartender's role as more than just a server of beverages, but as a facilitator of meaningful consumption, someone who understood the symbolic and psychological dimensions of drinking as well as its physical effects. As the saloon finally empties, with promises exchanged about tomorrow's Founders' Day celebration, you realize that you've witnessed not just casual drinking, but a complex system of community rituals that used alcohol as a medium for marking significant events, processing powerful emotions, and creating shared meaning in an environment where formal institutions for these purposes were often absent. The Frontier Saloon, in this light, appears less as a place of vice and more as a multifunctional community institution that helped frontier populations navigate life's challenges and celebrations through structured, meaningful, shared consumption, a function largely overlooked in stereotypical portrayals focused solely on recreational drinking. The next morning, you return to the saloon to find an unexpected scene. The swinging doors are propped open, and sunlight streams into the normally dim interior. A group of women in plain high-necked dresses stand outside, holding signs with slogans like "Lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine," and "For home and country." They sing hymns in clear, determined voices while glaring at the establishment. You've encountered the most significant challenge to frontier drinking culture, the temperance movement that would eventually lead to prohibition. Far from being a sudden development of the early 20th century, anti-alcohol activism cast a growing shadow over saloon culture throughout the later frontier period. Ladies of the Women's Christian Temperance Union size the bartender who's calmly wiping glasses despite the commotion outside. Every Founders' Day, they make their position known, been getting louder each year. The presence of temperance activists represents a fundamental tension in frontier communities as they transitioned from raw settlements to established towns. As communities matured, the institutional dominance of the saloon faced increasing challenges from churches, women's organizations, and civic reformers concerned about alcohol's negative effects. "They're not entirely wrong," admits an older miner sitting at the bar nursing a coffee rather than his usual whiskey. "Seen plenty of men drink away their wages while children went hungry. Seen others drink themselves to death. There's a dark side to our customs, sure as there's a bright one." This nuanced perspective was common among frontier residents, many of whom recognized both the benefits and harms of the drinking culture centered in saloons. Few outside the temperance movement advocated complete prohibition, but many acknowledged the need for some regulation or moderation of drinking practices that could cause community harm. The bartender nods toward a paper posted by the door, a new town ordinance limiting saloon hours and requiring closure on Sundays. "Compromise from last town meeting," he explains. Temperance ladies wanted full Sunday closure and 8 p.m. weekday closing, settled on Sunday afternoon opening and midnight closing most days. Neither side entirely happy, which probably means it's fair. This pattern of increasing regulation reflected the typical evolution of frontier communities. As informal settlements became organized towns, the previously unregulated drinking culture gradually came under civic control. Early ordinances typically focused on limiting hours, preventing sales to minors or the visibly intoxicated, and separating saloons from schools and churches. 5 years ago, we had 12 saloons in town, continues the bartender. Now we're down to 3. Licensing fees went up. Regulations got stricter. Respectable establishments survived while the rougher places closed. Towns growing up, for better or worse. This consolidation and regulation of drinking establishments was a common pattern across the frontier as communities matured. The wide-open drinking culture of early settlements gradually gave way to more controlled environments, with many smaller or more disreputable saloons forced out of business by increasing regulatory requirements. Outside, the temperance demonstration has attracted attention. Some men hurry past with averted eyes, while others make ostentatious displays of entering the saloon despite the protesters. A few stop to argue with the women, creating small knots of heated discussion on the boardwalk. Worst part is how it divides the town, observes a merchant taking a quick drink before returning to his store. Used to be the saloon united folks' place where differences didn't matter so much. Now it's becoming a symbol that separates decent folks from the rest of us, making neighbors into enemies over a glass of whiskey. This social division around drinking represented a significant change from earlier frontier periods when the saloon functioned as a unifying community institution. As alternative organizations like churches, schools, and civic associations developed, communities increasingly fractured along moral lines defined partly by attitudes toward alcohol consumption. The women outside begin a new song, Onward. Christian soldiers sung with pointed emphasis toward the saloon entrance. The bartender winces slightly but continues his preparations for the day. My wife's out there, he admits quietly. Supports the family by working here during the week. Protests with the church ladies on Sunday. We don't discuss it much at home. Lot of complicated feelings on all sides. This personal conflict within families and individuals reflected the complex reality of frontier communities in transition. Many residents simultaneously valued certain aspects of saloon culture while recognizing its problems. A nuanced position increasingly difficult to maintain as the issue became more polarized. A well-dressed man enters, clearly the town mayor, based on others' greetings. He nods respectfully to the temperance protesters before entering the saloon, embodying the political balancing act required of frontier leaders caught between traditional drinking culture and reform movements. Founders' Day compromise, he announces to the room at large. Temperance meeting at the church from 10 to noon. Traditional celebrations here from 2 onward. Anyone causing trouble on either side answers to me personally. His tone makes clear this is not an idle threat. This negotiated separation of activities represented a common approach to managing community tensions around alcohol. Rather than forcing an all-or-nothing choice, frontier leaders often created parallel systems that allowed both drinking and temperance cultures to coexist, albeit uneasily. As the day progresses, you observe the changing nature of the saloon's operations under this growing regulatory shadow. The bartender carefully logs each sale in a ledger, checks the age of younger-looking patrons, and monitors consumption levels more closely than you observed previously. New laws make me personally liable if someone gets drunk here and causes harm elsewhere, he explains. Used to be a man's drinking was his own business. Now it's becoming everybody's concern, especially the laws. This shift toward holding saloons accountable for the consequences of their service represented a fundamental change in frontier attitudes toward drinking. The previous norm of individual responsibility was gradually being replaced by concepts of social responsibility and public health that would eventually culminate in prohibition. The physical space of the saloon itself shows signs of adaptation to changing social expectations. The spittoons are cleaned more regularly, the floors swept, and the bar wiped down with what smells like carbolic solution. Windows previously covered with cloth now feature actual glass, allowing passersby to view the interior. Transparency, explains the bartender when you comment on these changes. Town council says respectable establishments should have nothing to hide. Makes it harder for unruly behavior when anyone walking by can see in. Changes the feeling of the place. But that's progress, I suppose. This architectural opening of previously enclosed male spaces reflected broader social changes as frontier communities developed. The private, separate world of male drinking culture was increasingly subject to public scrutiny and expected to conform to respectable standards previously ignored in earlier settlement periods. Even the beverages themselves show evidence of changing attitudes. The bartender points out newly arrived bottles with standardized labels and government tax stamps, early examples of the regulated commercial alcohol that would eventually replace local and informal production. Pure Food and Drug Acts, changing everything, he notes. Can't just sell anything and call it whiskey anymore. Has to meet standards, be properly labeled, pay appropriate taxes. Costs more but kills fewer customers, which seems a fair trade. This increasing regulation and standardization of alcohol itself represented another aspect of frontier drinking culture's evolution. The freewheeling, often dangerous world of adulterated spirits and homemade concoctions was gradually giving way to more controlled, consistent commercial products. The customers, too, demonstrate changing behaviors. Men drink more moderately, fewer openly carry firearms, and conversation remains generally civil despite the day's celebratory nature. The rowdier elements that might have dominated earlier frontier saloons are noticeably absent or subdued. Rough characters mostly moved on, explains an older resident. Mining's becoming more corporate. Companies want sober, reliable workers. Cattle industries stabilizing with regular shipments rather than seasonal drives. Wild elements follow opportunity, and opportunities shifting further west or north. This economic transformation underpinned many changes in frontier drinking culture. As boom and bust economies based on rapid resource extraction gave way to more stable, corporate-controlled industries, the workforce shifted from predominantly single, transient men to more settled workers with families and community ties. The afternoon Founders' Day celebrations reveal how the saloon was adapting to maintain relevance in this changing environment. The traditional heavy drinking remains, but is now accompanied by a community meal served on proper tables, a display of historical photographs and artifacts, and even the presence of a few respectable women accompanying their husbands. Trying to reposition ourselves, the bartender admits, can't just be a drinking hole anymore. Need to be part community center, part restaurant, part historical society. Give people reasons to support us, besides just serving alcohol. This diversification strategy was common among frontier saloons facing temperance pressure. Many establishments expanded their food service, added hotel accommodations, hosted community events, or otherwise attempted to become more multifunctional and thus more difficult to eliminate solely on anti-alcohol grounds. As evening approaches, the day's complex balance of forces becomes even more evident. The temperance women have departed, but their influence lingers in the relatively restrained nature of the celebration. The saloon is full but not rowdy, festive but not chaotic, with drinking happening alongside eating, storytelling, and community recognition ceremonies. 10 years ago, half the town would be unconscious by now, observes the sheriff, who's monitoring the proceedings with vigilant but not hostile attention. Now most folks know their limits better, still enjoy themselves, but keep control. Progress doesn't have to mean the end of tradition, just its improvement. This evolutionary rather than revolutionary approach characterized how many frontier communities navigated the transition from wide-open drinking culture to more regulated environments. Rather than complete rejection of saloon traditions, many communities sought to reform and civilize these practices, preserving their social benefits while mitigating their harms. As the Founders' Day celebration continues into the night, you realize you're witnessing not just a community event, but a culture in transition, the final chapter of traditional frontier saloon culture as it adapted to changing social expectations, increasing regulation, and the growing shadow of the temperance movement that would eventually culminate in national prohibition. The Frontier Saloon, once the dominant and unchallenged center of community life, was gradually becoming just one institution among many, still important, but increasingly required to justify its existence against moral and social criticism. The changes you observe reflect not the sudden death of frontier drinking culture, but its gradual transformation into forms that could survive in an increasingly modern, regulated society. Dawn breaks on your final day in the frontier town. You return to the saloon one last time, finding it quieter than previous visits. The bartender is taking inventory, carefully counting bottles and making notes in a leather-bound ledger. He nods in greeting as you enter. "Perfect timing," he says. "Was just thinking about how much this place has changed. Been tending bar in Western Territories for 30 years now. Seen the whole story unfold. You've arrived at a moment of reflection, a chance to understand the final chapter of the authentic frontier saloon as the Wild West era drew to a close." By the early 1900s, the frontier saloon as it had existed in its classic form was already disappearing, transformed by changing social attitudes, economic realities, and the approach of prohibition. First saloon I worked in was just a tent with a plank across 2 barrels. The bartender reminisces, pausing in his inventory. Middle of a Montana gold strike in '77. No glass in the windows, because there weren't any windows. No floor but the dirt. Sold whatever rock gut the supply wagons brought in. Never asked what was in it. Men drank it anyway. This evolution from primitive beginnings to the relatively established business you now observe represents the compressed history of the frontier saloon, a remarkably rapid development cycle that followed patterns of settlement and economic development across the Western Territories. You notice a newspaper on the bar, its headline announcing the admission of Oklahoma as the 46th state. The year is 1907. And the classic frontier era is drawing to a close. The bartender follows your gaze to the paper. "Every new state means more civilization, more laws," he comments. Territory days, a man could open a saloon with nothing but a bottle and a place to sit. Now you need licenses, inspections, proper facilities. Progress, they call it. This increasing regulation marked the formal end of the wide-open frontier drinking establishment. As territories gained statehood and adopted comprehensive legal codes, the previously unregulated frontier saloon became subject to licensing requirements, operating restrictions, and quality controls that fundamentally changed its character. Looking around, you notice subtle but significant changes from what you imagine earlier frontier saloons must have been like. The spittoons are fewer and smaller. The back room that once hosted rowdy gambling now contains pool tables and respectable card games. The free lunch has been replaced by a proper menu with listed prices. "Health department made us put in that kitchen last year," the bartender explains, following your observations. "Said we couldn't serve food across the bar anymore. Too unsanitary. Same with the bathing facilities upstairs. Either meet county standards or close them down. Easier to close them." These public health regulations represented another force transforming frontier saloons. As germ theory became widely accepted and public health became a government concern, many traditional saloon practices, from communal glassware to free lunch service, came under scrutiny and regulation. The bartender pulls out a framed photograph showing the saloon's interior circa 1885. The contrast with the current space is striking. What was once a crowded, smoky room packed with standing men now features more tables, better lighting, and a generally more organized appearance. "Fire codes," he explains simply. "Can't pack them in like sardines anymore. Need proper exits, proper capacity limits." Sheriff enforces it strictly since that dance hall fire over in Clayville killed 30 people. This increased attention to public safety represented yet another way that frontier saloons were forced to adapt to changing standards. The casual disregard for physical danger that characterized early frontier establishments became increasingly unacceptable as communities developed expectations of basic safety and security. The bottles behind the bar tell another story of transformation. The homemade labels and unmarked containers of earlier days have largely been replaced by standardized commercial products with proper government tax stamps. A special shelf holds bottles clearly marked as guaranteed pure under Food and Drug Act. Can't just sell anything as whiskey anymore, the bartender notes, gesturing toward these regulated products. Has to meet federal standards now. Customers expect consistency. Most don't even remember when you couldn't be sure what was actually in the bottle. This standardization of alcohol products marked a fundamental shift from frontier practices. The creative adulteration and local production that characterized early Western drinking were gradually replaced by regulated commercial products, fundamentally changing the drinking experience. The clientele has evolved as well. The few morning patrons represent a different demographic than the classic frontier drinker, less transient, better dressed, older on average. Missing are the cowboys, prospectors, and drifters that populated earlier frontier saloons. Working men drink less now, the bartender observes. Companies won't hire men who can't stay sober during work hours. Ranches and mines run on schedules, need reliable hands. Wild Bunch mostly moved on or settled down. These days I serve businessmen, farmers with established claims, railroad workers between shifts. This changing customer base reflected broader economic shifts as the frontier economy matured from extraction and exploration to more stable industries. The saloon's role evolved accordingly, shifting from the central institution of transient, male-dominated communities to one establishment among many in more settled, family-oriented towns. The physical location of the saloon within the community had changed as well. Once prominently located on main streets, many saloons were increasingly relegated to side streets or specific districts as towns implemented zoning regulations separating respectable businesses from drinking establishments. Used to be the most important building in town, the bartender comments, nodding toward the window where you can see the new bank and county offices dominating the main street. Now they'd prefer we keep out of sight. New ordinance says no new saloon licenses on Main Street. Existing businesses grandfathered in, but once we close, that's it. This spatial marginalization represented another aspect of the frontier saloon's decline. Its gradual exclusion from the commercial and civic center of communities that once revolved around it. As alternative institutions developed, the saloon was increasingly viewed as a problematic remnant of earlier, less civilized times. The women's temperance protesters you observed earlier were not an isolated phenomenon, but representatives of a growing national movement. The bartender shows you another newspaper clipping announcing that Oklahoma has entered the Union as a dry state, prohibiting alcohol entirely within its borders. Writings on the wall, he says soberly. Started with Kansas back in '81. Now several states have gone completely dry. Others have local option laws letting counties or towns decide. More join the list every year. This rising tide of prohibition represented the most existential threat to frontier saloon culture. What began as a moral reform movement gained political power throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gradually restricting and eliminating legal alcohol sales across increasing portions of the country. Not all these changes were viewed negatively by those in the industry. The bartender points out several improvements that came with increasing regulation, better quality products, safer environments, more professional service. and fewer of the negative social consequences that had given saloons their problematic reputation. Honest truth. I don't miss the days when men regularly drank themselves to death on adulterated rotgut, he admits. Don't miss the brawls, the occasional shootings, or watching miners drink away their entire season's earnings while families went hungry. There were dark sides to the old ways that folks get romantic about now, but weren't so pretty to witness. This nuanced perspective was common among industry veterans, who had seen both the positive social functions and destructive potential of frontier drinking culture. Many recognized that some reforms were necessary and beneficial, even as they resisted complete prohibition. Alternative drinking establishments were also transforming the landscape. The bartender mentions new competitors, gentlemen's clubs with restricted membership, hotel bars catering to travelers, restaurants serving alcohol with meals, and beer gardens marketing themselves as family-friendly spaces where women could be present without risking their reputations. Diversify or die, he summarizes. Plain old saloon with nothing but whiskey and beer won't survive much longer. Need food, service, entertainment, hotel rooms, something besides just drinks to bring people through the door. This diversification strategy represented a common response to changing conditions. Many traditional saloons evolved into restaurants, hotels, or entertainment venues that served alcohol as part of a broader business model rather than as their primary product. Even the drinks themselves had evolved. The bartender demonstrates by preparing a cocktail far more elaborate than the simple whiskey or beer that dominated earlier frontier drinking, a careful mixture of regulated whiskey, imported vermouth, bitters, and a cherry garnish. Fancy mixed drinks are the future, he predicts. Can charge more, use less actual alcohol per serving, appeal to a more respectable clientele. Straight whiskies associated with the old rough days. Modern drinkers want sophistication. This evolution toward cocktail culture represented another adaptation strategy, elevating drinking from its frontier reputation as crude intoxication to a more refined, sophisticated pleasure. By emphasizing skill, quality ingredients, and moderation, these new approaches attempted to separate modern drinking from its frontier associations. As noon approaches, the bartender begins preparation for the day's business, his movements efficient from decades of practice. He seems simultaneously a living connection to the vanishing frontier era and an adapter to the emerging modern age, embodying the transition happening across Western communities. People ask if I miss the old days, he muses as he arranges glasses. Truth is, every era has its time. Frontier Saloon served its purpose when communities needed one place that could be everything to everybody. Now towns have churches, schools, proper restaurants, hotels, meeting halls. Natural that drinking would find a different place in society. This philosophical acceptance of change characterized many who had witnessed the frontier saloon's evolution. Rather than simply lamenting its decline, they recognized it as part of the inevitable development of Western society, from frontier conditions to established communities. As you prepare to leave, the bartender offers a final observation that captures the essential truth about frontier saloons and their beverages. They were never just about the alcohol itself, but about the social functions, community needs, and human connections they facilitated. What we really served wasn't just whiskey or beer, he concludes. It was whatever the community needed most at that moment. A meeting place, a communication center, a financial exchange, a courthouse, a celebration hall, a refuge. The drinks were just the medium that made those other functions possible. As long as people need those things, they'll find ways to create spaces for them, with or without alcohol. With this insight, you realize that what was truly served in frontier saloons was more than just beverages. It was civilization itself. taking root in challenging environments through the shared rituals, economic exchanges, and community bonds that these establishments made possible. The drinks were simply the visible manifestation of these deeper human needs for connection, structure, and meaning on the frontier edge of American society. As the frontier saloon gradually faded from American life, transformed by regulation, replaced by specialized institutions, and eventually interrupted by prohibition, what endured was not the specific drinking practices, but the fundamental social functions they had served. The frontier saloon didn't so much disappear as evolve and disperse, its various roles distributed among the multiple institutions of modern American communities. The frontier saloon gradually fades from your vision as you drift toward sleep. The swinging doors, the amber glasses, the piano notes, and the murmur of voices soften into the background of your consciousness. What remains is not just the history of what people drank, but the understanding of why they gathered to drink together, the human connections forged in these imperfect, vital spaces. The frontier saloon served its moment in American history, providing structure and community when formal institutions were absent. Its evolution and eventual transformation weren't simply about changing attitudes toward alcohol, but about the maturation of society itself. The transition from frontier improvisation to established communities with specialized institutions. As you finally surrender to sleep, you carry with you not just knowledge of what was in those frontier glasses, but appreciation for the essential human needs they served, for connection, for ritual, for community, and for civilization itself, taking root in the challenging soil of the American West.